Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is April the 24th, 2022, and we are going to talk about the world, what has happened, and so on. Without further ado, I will jump into the voice channel here and we will say words together. Bonjour. Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good, you?
I'm doing okay.
Just okay? Is that like a strong okay or a weak okay?
Just just normal, I guess.
Just a normal okay. Agent Smith rates his day a 5 out of 10. Right down the middle.
I have nothing to complain about.
I can complain
How
for
have you
you.
been doing?
Pretty well. I had a Easter family trip last weekend. We did lots of frontier stuff, like have bison burgers, and we had an Easter egg hunt. We hiked up a mountain. I got the whole family to do it. I was really proud of them. It was actually kind of grueling. They disliked me more and more as we hiked further and further up the mountain, and then once we got to the top, they felt pretty excited and happy. So I'm glad that they made it to that point. Going down, you have gravity on your side, but you can also slip more, so
Yeah.
it's a little bit less physically taxing, but a little bit more dicey. What else did we do? We shot some heckin' guns, which was fun. Just put a target up on a tree and bop, bop, bop. Practice gun safety and that kind of a thing. And had really good food throughout, which is a blessing. Parents have a couple of Australian shepherds. I'll actually just show them on the stream for fun, because I got a video background of them in the snow. But there's some good heckin' dogs.
Sounds like a nice day.
Yeah. It was Thursday to Tuesday, I think. So like a big weekend plus trip. And I also got a new keyboard recently that was a custom built. This is the kind of keyboard that's so fancy, I don't even know how to describe it. But it's a really heavy keyboard with the most exquisite parts that you can get. Pretty much. You could get a little bit fancier than this, but it's got like a metal frame and stuff. It feels about 8 times the weight of a regular keyboard that you would buy from the store. And I got to choose which kind of key switch that I get. And everything was handcrafted and assembled by a fellow StarCraft streamer in the scene, which I'll link his stream now.
Oh, pretty swanky.
Yeah. I get a ton of mileage out of a keyboard, and it's part of my job, so deduct business expense.
There you go.
Yeah, it was a little treat to myself, I guess. It's not exactly performance enhancing, but it's certainly pleasant to have.
Yeah.
My pal Sal, yeah. Well, we've had a couple major developments that I can report first. Bitter Sugar is doing well. His family is all alive and hanging in there. And he heckin' moved back to his place in Kyiv. So there are some people who are just like, okay, well, I guess it's fine for me to go back to the city. And he got his computer all set up and he was watching the stream from his house yesterday. So that's cool.
Good for him.
Yeah. And then the other big item that I woke up to this morning at a nice DGen time of 11:50 was the French election. Macron wins.
Yep.
Not really a surprise. I think Le Pen was the more crazy candidate that was more of kind of a long shot to even be in the running for the final two, but she ended up getting a big share of the vote. It was like 41% or something. And to be clear, that's not 41% of all French people. I saw 26% abstain from the vote. But Macron got like 50, 51 or 53, something like that.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there was a little bit of concern in the lead up that maybe the vote would be too close to call and that it could go either way.
Mm.
But it seems like Macron got a relatively decent lead. Although, like you mentioned, the real victors were the abstainers. Yeah, there's lots of jaded people over there, like in a lot of developed countries at the moment.
Like
It
where
doesn't
they feel
seem to
like
a
their
lot of
vote
people.
doesn't matter.
Well, yeah, it doesn't seem like their vote matters in some cases, but there's also people that don't really think the government is addressing problems that relate to them. You know,
Mm.
they don't really feel like the government is dealing with issues that are important to them, be they of the left or right wing variety. And it could be that there's also people that just don't think the government can really do anything, for what can't really do anything about the kinds of problems they're concerned about, for legal reasons or political reasons or what have you. So there's only so much a government can do, and a lot of people are just disenchanted
Do you
by
know
the
what some of
inability.
those problems would be for the French people?
Well, if you're on the far right, you want to get rid of the immigrants,
Yeah.
which is not legal and is probably not going to happen. If you're on the far left, you're most concerned about the health of the welfare state, among other things. But the French economy just isn't really growing enough to kind of warrant further expansion or even maintaining it as it is in a lot of cases. So there's not much that can be done there. So they're just kind of stuck. And if you're one of those people, what can you do?
Mm-hmm.
Voting isn't really going to solve the issue one way or the other.
It makes sense. I think usually the right is more concerned with like limiting immigration or changing it in some way. I know that
Mm.
was a similar talking point for the U.S. elections too. What do
Yeah,
you
and it's,
do about immigration?
it's been a hot topic. Nobody really has any answers to it. I think overall the US is probably doing the best out of the developed countries that have this as an issue because the US is pretty good at assimilating people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of makes it a moot point, whether they're different or not and whether they're going to change things is kind of rendered moot by the fact that by and large they assimilate. It's kind of a two-way street. Whenever the United States gets a big wave of immigrants, historically speaking, they end up affecting the culture and changing it at least a little bit. That's why they call it a melting pot. But for the most part, they do assimilate, so that kind of smooths things over and that makes it kind of easier, so that you don't have as much consternation over clashing cultural values of one kind or another. Europe has struggled more with that. There's been different models that have been tried, but none of them really seem to work all that well.
Mm-hmm.
Like France is extremely assimilationist. Like their thing is that if you're going to go and live in France, you have to be French.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of people who have come over from places like North Africa who have kind of struggled to do that, or at least do that to a degree that is amenable, to the people who are most concerned about it, especially people on the right. So that's where you get things like the protests and the banlieues and the riots, things like that. And neither left nor right wing really have solutions to that, at least none that really seem likely to work. It's always difficult when you end up with like a ghettoized community. Not every immigrant from North Africa lives in the ghetto, most of them don't, but because immigration is kind of a hot topic, people tend to focus on the most extreme manifestations of failed assimilation. So people disproportionately focus on the banlieues, even though they're not really representative.
Well, yeah, people are gonna always look for evidence that kind of backs up what their plan would be.
Yeah. Yeah, confirmation bias is as much a factor in European politics as it is anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the French approach. They've been struggling with that. But then there's also the British approach, which is to kind of go the other way, which is to be very multicultural and try to institutionalize differences. I remember reading back in the day that they had, at a local level, councils that were meant to represent different groups and give them a forum in which they could kind of air out their differences and negotiate with each other, uh, to try to smooth those out. But it's kind of a mixed bag there as well. It's kind of the same problem. Like there is just some communities which are very homogenous, gateway immigrant communities that have kind of struggled. And so that's created problems with some of the nationalists on the right who, don't really appreciate that. So it seems like trying to go the multicultural route has problems as well. And then you get a case like Germany where they invited in, millions of Turkish workers back in the 60s and the 70s. And they just kind of pretend like they're still temporary, even though they've been there ever since.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of turning a blind eye to it to a degree. So I don't know how well that's working either, because they have similar problems. But, those are kind of the big three, and all of them are still kind of struggling to find a public policy solution to that. I'm not saying the United States is like perfect. I mean, we still have certainly our own struggles with that. But in general, there seems to be a path forward for the US, more so than in Europe.
Yeah, you also have a lot more land mass. It's a newer country.
Mm.
So for us to be able to accommodate a lot of immigration, I think makes sense.
Yeah, the United States doesn't have as much of a tradition of blood and soil nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes it a little easier to it makes it easier for new groups to come in and kind of integrate and complement the people who were here before. With Europe, that nationalist identity kind of does have a lineage to it that goes back, hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, depending. And for that style of nationalism, it just doesn't inherently lend itself to being open to new people. So there's a little bit of a block there. I think in the long run, things will probably work out. I think in general, even in Europe, there's still assimilation happening for the most part. But it's just kind of a new thing. I mean, Europe really hasn't had this kind of mixing, this kind of influx of new people since before World War II, even before that, probably, 19th century. Europe was pretty mixed ethnically back in the day. Lots of different people from different ethnic groups from all around Europe all mixing together. And after World War II, the first half of the 20th century, they ended up with basically ethno-states, states that were mostly ethnically homogenous just because of all of the ethnic cleansing and the Holocaust and, all this, that, and the other forms of various violence that was inflicted by governments against their own people, as well as people in neighboring states, and it had somewhat of a traumatic effect. So that was unfortunate, but it also resulted in societies that were homogenous, such that differences between different groups of ethnic groups and immigrants and whatnot wasn't really as much of an issue. So a lot of people, on the extremes of European politics kind of got to have their cake and eat it too. The far right got to basically ethnically cleanse big chunks of Europe, and then the far left was able to get welfare states in the case of Western Europe, and then in the case of Eastern Europe, of course, they got the full Monty of state capitalism. Well, not state capitalism, command economy management. So Europe really hasn't had to struggle too much with differences over, immigration, cultural values, and whatnot. And now that we're kind of getting into a new era of European history where there is more diversity, it's kind of returning as an issue. And unfortunately, it seems there's still a lot of people that are really not ready for that. But overall, it'll probably even out in the long run. We'll see.
I think in some ways, being an internet kid can make you feel more of a general sense of being a citizen of the world rather than beholden to one particular nation, especially if you speak common languages with other people. It makes it feel like the divisions are less impactful than they were in the past when we were relatively more isolated.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a kind of latter day online cosmopolitanism.
Hmm.
The internet really inculcates that, especially if you're a heavy user. But the trouble is, not everybody is a heavy user. Some people have more of a casual relationship with the internet, and for a lot of them, their perspectives are still more defined by traditional perspectives, as shaped by conservative culture or maybe mid 20th century labor movement type culture.
Hmm.
Sort of the old school leftist culture. And that's those sort of mindsets are still dominant easily. We if you're like us, you spend a lot of time on the internet and engaging with online content and internet culture, it's easy to kind of get the sense that, that's representative, but it's still not. Like, most people don't live that kind of life. They don't have that kind of engagement, and so their perspectives are correspondingly different.
Yeah, and
So
I
for
saw something kind of recently that was looking at the concentration of wealth across generations. And it's probably always been this way, but the elder generations have way higher share of the overall money than younger generations do, which makes sense because they've had a longer time to invest in stuff and work and save and see their assets grow than people who like are just knee deep in college debt right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, you're right that it's always the case that, the older people tend to have more money just because they've had more time to save money. But the current cohort of older folks in the West, so to speak, Europe and North America, if not also Japan, some of the other developed economies out in East Asia, they kind of worked, they spent their prime working years kind of in an era where there was a lot of liberalization happening in the economy, and that created a lot of opportunities to amass much more wealth than had been possible in previous eras, or
Mm-hmm.
at least certainly in the preceding era. So yeah, it's had a big effect on the data. There's definitely a big, disproportionately large amount of wealth concentrated in the current cohort of older folks for that reason. So it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably gonna change because I don't know that there's a lot more room to maneuver in terms of further liberalization, at least in terms of the United States. It's not really politically viable for one, but even if it were, I don't know how much more there is you could really do that would have a big impact anyway on the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
There's little things you could do that would help specific communities. Certainly a lot of Trump voters were excited about Trump, taking on regulations of commodities markets. Well, not commodities markets per se, but the extractive industries. Like the extraction of minerals, oil, things like that. Those are disproportionately important industries in rural areas in the United States, and so people there are particularly sensitive to regulations thereof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, regulation of those industries is an attack on them, is how it can feel.
Yeah, yeah, they feel that a lot more than other communities in the United States, and it did work. I think there was some article in The Economist I read, and they were looking at the data for different groups of people in the United States. Rural, urban, and then I think also small cities or something like that. And what they found is that after the first 2 years or so of the Trump administration, rural areas, well, the economy in rural areas more specifically, had indeed improved pretty considerably, in terms of output and employment. In other areas like the suburbs and inner cities, the changes were much more marginal. I think in general they improved, but it wasn't by much. But rural areas definitely got a lot better. So that's probably a big reason why, people there still support him so much. For them, their lives objectively improved, at least in terms of economic outlook, while he was president, as a result of some of his policies. But Europe also has, not a lot of room. I think in terms of public policy, there's a lot Europe could do in terms of liberalization, but it's even less politically viable there. You know, you could go so far as to say it would be political suicide, at least in some countries. Liberalization is not popular there, suffice to say.
Why not?
Well, I mean, it's capitalism, right? That's just like that's an American thing, for one. So it's almost a foreign alien idea at this point. But beyond that, you know, Europe has a much stronger labor force. Well, not labor force per se, but it has much more organized labor. It's much more impactful politically, and so they don't really like that's kind of laissez-faire free market capitalism. They prefer to have more protections, more regulation, whatnot. And so, for that historical reason, there's generally much more animus towards laissez-faire free market style reforms. They do things a little bit differently in that regard. So it's just not very popular. Generally, I mean, the UK is kind of the exception. They had Thatcher and the Conservatives back in the 80s. They had a big sort of liberalization period where they implemented a lot of conservative reforms of the economy. But even then, it was pretty controversial, and there's still a lot of people that really hate Thatcher in the UK because she did that, especially in the north of the country. A lot of mining communities were just gutted by a lot of those reforms. But continental Europe is just no. At least not in like Western Europe. You know, in Eastern Europe, you could probably see more. You know, there's still a lot of people that have bad memories in Eastern Europe of the command economy system that was inflicted on them by the Soviets and by local communists. So there's relatively more acceptance of capitalism there. But in Western Europe, definitely no. You know, France, Italy, Belgium, you know, these kinds of places are not friendly to capitalism. And Germany kind of has a healthier relationship with it. You know, they kind of try to harness it while managing it. There's sort of a nice balance between management and labor unions. And German political culture being what it is, they inculcate, just by dint of that culture, a collaborative, cooperative atmosphere. You know, it's just the norm that different groups and interest groups work together rather than sort of exhibit more of an adversarial relationship like what you would see in the United States, for example. It's not to say that they don't have their problems, but again, it's just a matter of degree. You know, they're much better at cooperation in Germany, but they also tend to allow the free market to kind of operate a little more than in other countries.
I think the U.S. used to cooperate better, like in previous decades, than we do now.
Yeah, but that was kind of a temporary thing. That was the result of trauma more than it was an outgrowth of American political culture. You know, the Great Depression. Well, I mean, even before the Great Depression, like the 1920s was a period of rapid growth, right? So there was a lot of tension there. There was a lot of competition between companies. You know, one of the things they would do is that they would, you know, sometimes they would even pay workers at a rival company to go on strike, you know, stuff like that, like sneaky underhanded stuff. And then the Great Depression happened, and that created, you know, a lot of hardship for workers. And so out of that, you get the Roosevelt administration, right? So FDR comes to power, and his administration and his allies in Congress really reshaped, you know, the entire landscape of labor management relations in the United States by way of institutionalizing a mechanism, an institutional mechanism by which you could oversee and regulate, you know, unions, the way that capital interacted with labor unions, and you know, all manner of other reforms as well. I mean, it's a pretty extensive list of the things that the National Labor Board does, and a lot of that, you know, a lot of that institution was just designed in that period in the 1930s. So from that period, from the 1930s through, let's say, like the 1960s or so, there was a pretty strong period of cooperation. But again, that mostly was just because of that period where Democrats specifically pro-labor Democrats were able to win enough power that they were able to push those changes and keep power for a long time. I mean, there was an extended period of several decades there through the 30s, 40s, 50s, kind of, and then ending in the 60s, where pro-labor Democrats were solidly and reliably in power in the United States. And that made it relatively easy for them to kind of maintain that regulatory regime, inculcating more positive and healthier relations between labor and capital. But as soon as that era ended, obviously it changed pretty dramatically. The 70s was a mess. There was a lot of deregulation there, but there was still a lot of attempts to hang on to the previous, more statist approach to managing the economy. We didn't have as much of a statist approach as Europe did. That's kind of always been true, but certainly the United States in the 70s was much more accepting of state intervention in the economy than it became later, up to and including now. But after the 70s, going into the 80s, there was a lot of deregulation, much more so that we kind of had an equivalent to what happened with the UK and Thatcher in the United States at that time. And sort of that neoliberal era that started in the 80s was pretty much ongoing through until 2008, I want to say. Although it hasn't really been unwound either. Hasn't been a whole lot of change in that regard. But there was a pretty consistent period of growing liberalization of the economy through that 30-year period. So in that time, labor unions became much weaker, not just because of regulatory changes, but also just because of the structure of the economy. There was kind of a shift away from the kind of mass worker, major big factories, like used to defined heavy industry in the United States. Now industry gets outsourced or it gets modernized and automated to the degree that they just don't need as many people to produce the same amount of stuff. And even in the parts of the United States that still have factories, they are not really part of it used to be that factories would build a city, right? If you built a factory, a city would grow up around it. But that doesn't really seem to happen as much now. Like cities like Chicago, for example, kind of grew out of the meatpacking industry and the slaughterhouse industry and whatnot. And so that, facilitated a tremendous amount of growth that made it one of the largest cities in the world. Also, it was a transportation hub. There was other factors at play too, but the fact that they were the site for so many factories really helped juice the city's population growth. But now a factory just doesn't have the same effect. I don't think I've ever heard of a city, at least in the developed world, in the past couple decades, really growing out of a factory investment, like what you would see in the 19th century. It doesn't really seem to happen like that anymore. And I would add here the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, so, if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody, so please do correct me in chat, if I say anything wrong, stupid, or biased. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And I mention it now because maybe somebody has a counter example of a city that did just that in the developed world. I think there's some in the developing world. Probably China has a number of those. Shenzhen, for example, probably qualifies. But in the West, in Europe and the United States, it doesn't seem to happen like that. All of the major cities in the United States now are cities that kind of grew out of the second era, let's say the first era of industrialization in the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century. The cities that became major population centers in the mid-late 20th century generally got to be that way because of other factors. Transportation hubs, logistics, deregulation, allowing businesses to set up headquarters, making them attractive for that reason. Services type stuff, basically, not so much manufacturing. But yeah, that's why there was more cooperation. I'm sure there's a lot more nuance to that, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it was less so that people were just nicer and were better at making agreements with stuff, and it was just that the pendulum of power swung pretty heavily to one side.
Yeah. Yeah, it never really stopped being an adversarial relationship.
Hmm.
You could kind of see how much it swung back in the other direction over the 80s, 90s, and aughts. In Europe, by contrast, they don't do that so much. There's some swings, between one side or the other, but in general, they've institutionalized the relationship between management and labor such that you don't have quite those wild swings. And so things are much more stable and predictable as a result. A little more stagnant too, but that's a price I think a lot of people are willing to pay in Europe, if not, also the United States, certainly amongst a lot of the pro-labor part of the political spectrum. Well, was there anything else exciting that caught your eye?
So the French election was one item. And then I had the bitter sugar update. I'm trying to think of if there was another one. It's not really an item that you can do too much about, I don't think, but there is a person who uh, sort of like committing seppuku in front of the White House. They self-immolated for climate change
Well, when did that happen?
like 2 days ago.
Oh, wow. I guess I missed that.
Yeah, it was on Earth Day. Apparently, they predicted it like years in advance. Supreme Court, thank you for the correction, not the White House.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Well, certainly a lot of activism in Washington. Maybe it's not that surprising in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to change much. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be like Bouazizi in Tunisia. You know, the guy who set himself on fire after his, what was it, like his fruit cart? He was a street peddler and he had a cart that he sold, I think, food from. And one of the local police tried to shake him down. And when he wouldn't pay, or maybe couldn't pay, they seized his cart.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, it's hard to be a street peddler, like, even in the best of circumstances, but it's even harder in a place like Tunisia, which is relatively poor. You can just barely eke out a living doing that. And so when they took his cart, that was actually a pretty significant setback, for him. And he kind of just snapped and decided that he was going to self-immolate as a form of protest. And that really struck a chord. His story really struck a chord with a lot of people, and that sparked the Arab Spring and everything that came out of that. So self-immolation as a form of protest definitely has a lot of history to it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the famous case of the Buddhist monks in Vietnam who did that in protest against the Diem government. Although I guess that was South Vietnam technically at the time.
Yeah, you wouldn't really expect any act like that to necessarily be the one thing that changes everything, but it definitely sends a pretty loud signal. And talking about climate change and stuff, I've already noticed that the conversation has shifted over the past decade, just in how people talked about it. I think
Mm.
like 10 years ago, there were a lot more people who just straight up denied climate change, and it's edged closer and closer to, well, is it human caused? And that's the conversation, but there's more of a general agreement that something is happening. There are different weather events and things that haven't typically happened in certain regions. And if you just like look around at documentaries and stuff, at the massive heaps of garbage and different uh, environments that we've pretty clearly fucked up by our own kind of mess, there is progress being made. So this could just be another loud signal on that front.
Yeah. Yeah, there's going to be more and more consternation about it,
Mm-hmm.
just because of the way the climate is changing, but also because environmental groups have a lot more support than they used to, and they become much more effective at mobilizing people, as well as more effective at proposing policies, that can achieve their objectives. It used to be kind of more of a grassroots thing, back in like the 60s, 70s. People were just as heartfelt, but there wasn't as many of them,
Mm-hmm.
and they tended to take more of a reactive approach. somebody wanted to build something, they would be against it. It's like a nuclear power plant or something.
Yeah.
Nuclear power in particular is like a big bugbear for them. So they've since evolved a lot. They've developed a lot of new institutions. There didn't really used to be a whole lot of like environmentalist NGOs, but there's since grown. They've since grown in number pretty considerably, and they've actually got some really professional people. I've heard what was it? I read an article about like a regulator in Washington. I think he's like a bureaucrat somewhere in the administrative state, and he was saying that he actually respected a lot of the environmentalist think tanks and NGOs a lot because a lot of their people are pretty smart and top notch. They talk with him, interact with him, and they kind of are able to influence the policy making process in a traditional way, kind of in the same way that corporations do. The same sort of avenues of influence. They didn't used to do that, but they've learned to play the game pretty well, and apparently to the point where at least one bureaucrat really was impressed with their efforts.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects that will be a major edge in pushing anything through successfully is giving some financial angle to the argument. I think a lot
Yeah.
of the push for fighting against climate change and stuff was a lot more emotion based and like you should value this sort of a thing, which is almost like guilt tripping people into changing, as opposed to, hey, we've got this alternative to oil which would make us less reliable on this and this, which gives us more independence. Ooh, that's suddenly a very American argument. We like self-reliance and we like independence, and we're doing it for those reasons rather than because tree's good. But some people are just happy with the tree's good, ocean good, don't fuck it up, and then they're set and they're willing to invest and sometimes make sacrifices for that. But yeah, if you're wanting to be competitive, having a money argument is definitely good. It's been interesting how the war has been getting people to talk more about being less reliant on oil, because if the country that you're buying oil from suddenly does stuff that's really bad and you continue to buy, then it's not exactly like you supported, but kind of like that.
Yeah, it adds extra impetus.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you could kind of put it like that. Certainly there's much more of an impetus now than there was before when a lot of political actors in Europe were arguing that an invasion was unlikely
Mm-hmm.
and that it would be better to have a positive relationship with Russia just to keep markets stable and to try to encourage Russia to behave itself. Since, if the status quo means that Russia makes all the money it wants and needs by way of commodity sales to Europe, then why rock the boat? Why do something that would imperil that? Flawed logic, as has been since proven, but so the thinking went at the time. Yeah, the growth in environmental sentiment in Western politics, is definitely having a big impact. It's one of the things I've been trying to keep track of is the reemergence of industrial policy in the developed world. It had been pretty much discredited, not completely, but there was a lot of skepticism about industrial policy, especially in that neoliberal era that started in the 1980s that I mentioned before. In that period, industrial policy was seen as mostly being a waste of money, and that it would be better if governments just allowed the private sector to keep their money so that they could use it as they saw fit. But since 2008, there's been much more skepticism among the public of that kind of reasoning. So there is more of a desire to try to get states back into the economic game to some degree, to try to get them investing in new technologies and trying to attract business and entrepreneurs so that they can reinvigorate their economies. And so there's been a lot of talk about, again, new technologies, and a lot of those new technologies are sort of environmentalist in nature. Like one of the big ones is hydrogen power. Hope I'm remembering that correctly. So there's like a debate between different types of hydrogen, blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. One of them is much more dirty than the other, so I don't remember which was which, but the environmentally the environmentalists, I think, want blue hydrogen, if I'm not mistaken. But maybe it's no, actually, it's green hydrogen. That's why it's called green. That makes more sense. Yeah, that one's much more environmentally friendly because the production process itself is much less polluting, whereas blue hydrogen still uses like a lot of fossil fuel inputs or something like maybe they use a lot of electricity. I don't quite remember the details. But because hydrogen power has so much promise, a lot of governments are trying to invest in research on that technology so that their companies can be the first to dominate the market because it's expected that that could be a really huge market if it takes off.
Mm-hmm.
So stuff like that is very common amongst people who talk about industrial policy. That seems to be the direction a lot of countries are moving in. It's not even just the developed world. I think I remember reading about the government of Egypt investing in hydrogen research, trying to get their own producers off the ground. There's other examples too. That's just one of them. But yeah, environmentalism seems to be pushing states towards older forms of economic intervention that they haven't done in a long time. And the interesting thing is that it actually doesn't really challenge the existing neoliberal order that much, because neoliberalism is all about small government, free markets, but it also leaves room for state intervention to deal with problems that the private sector isn't as good at dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's something of a collective action problem, and if you have a sort of free market model, so the states do still have a role to play, at the very least in terms of ensuring competition in the free market space, but also in dealing with things like negative externalities, like pollution, for example. So, in so much as climate change is a negative externality that the private sector isn't really pricing correctly, there's room then, even within a neoliberal framework, for the state to step in and actually manage that. And of course, there's some debate about exactly how to manage it. There's lots of different things you can do to different degrees, but in general, the climate change problem has opened the door to state intervention, a door which was previously closed. And so we could then be entering a new era where there is a much greater state role in interacting with the economy than we've seen within our lifetimes. You and me, Neuro, specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not entirely clear how that's going to pan out, because on the one hand, there's a lot of things states can do to kind of help people in terms of industrial policy. Generating jobs, giving people and communities a new livelihood and whatnot. But the downside is that, historically speaking, a lot of industrial policies have not really worked out that well. It sounds great on paper to try to develop a new industry from scratch, with state resources, but in practice, it's kind of missed more than it's hit, so to speak. There's generally been more failures than successes.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe that doesn't matter if the objective was just to generate jobs for people, like if you want jobs for college educated people so that they don't leave your country, brain drain, for example. Industrial policy could result in, jobs that keep them in the country. And maybe the industry that you try to prop up fails, but at least those people were still in the country, and maybe they get experience and save up some money, and they can start some new entrepreneurial activity, some new business that creates knock-on positive economic effects in the country. So if that's the objective, a kind of glorified jobs program, then it doesn't really matter if they fail that much. But if the objective is to actually develop the country and create new modern industries, that can be a problem. Because if all of them fail, then you're just out of luck, and that has happened. Vietnam tried to kind of emulate the South Korean and Japanese model, where they tried to build an export-oriented economy, and for a while it was working relatively well, but then there was a lot of corruption and mismanagement in the state-owned companies that were sort of meant to be the vanguard of the modernization effort, and a lot of those companies just ended up going bankrupt. I remember the big shipbuilding company that the Vietnamese government had propped up ended up collapsing. So there's no guarantee it'll work. Just because the Asian tiger economies did it doesn't mean everybody can do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very particular set of factors that were at play there, and not all of them can be replicated easily. So, excuse me. In unrelated news, I got my sleep schedule back on track, so
Nice.
now I'm actually getting tired at an appropriate time of day. Unfortunately, that corresponds with our segment here.
What time are you waking up then?
6 a.m. lately.
6 a.m.? That's so early.
For me, anyway. But yeah, when your sleep schedule kind of moves around the clock, you just kind of get up when you get up. But I'd
Yeah,
much
true.
rather be getting up at 6 a.m. and going to bed at 10 than whatever weird shit I was doing before.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have friends in China who I talk to semi-regularly, and normally it's kind of difficult to get a time to talk because they're literally on the other side of the planet. It's a 12-hour some difference. So, there's like maybe two periods of time during the day when you could call them, your morning and their night, or their night and your morning,
Mm-hmm.
or other way around, but you get the idea. But yeah, when my sleep schedule was all messed up, that wasn't a problem. I could just call them during their day, and it was easy. Yeah, having healthy sleep habits is important to maintaining your health. Don't be
True.
like me.
Look to Agent Smith if you're curious about what not to do with your sleep.
Among other things, but certainly that one. Well, was there anything else you wanted to kind of cover? I kind of lost my train of thought on the last one. I hope I covered the original question.
Yeah, I gave just a general picture as to why environmentalism might be having an uptick recently.
Oh, yeah. Right, and I was industrial policy and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the environmentalism will be a big part of the near future, I think. I don't think they'll get everything they want. And, if they're right about, the climate, then we're probably screwed anyway. But, yeah, I think in general, they're going to be a major player to a degree that was just not possible before. They've just got way more support. And it's also much more broad based before. The support they had before was like a very niche group of people on the left. It was sort of like a left wing activist sort of a genesis for that movement. But since then, they've got people at the upper levels of corporations, NGOs, government, the administrative apparatus. There's lots of environmentalists now all over the place, and so the support base for their ideas and policies is much deeper now. They have much more to work with in terms of activism than they had previously. Trying to find, did we have any questions?
Yes, we do.
We did? Okay, I'm trying to find the thing here. There it is. You'd think I'd remember where it was after doing this for 5 years.
Green hydrogen is made by electrolysis of water, and blue hydrogen is made from methane, which is natural gas.
Oh, thank you for the clarification.
Thank you, Fuzzy Cold.
I've read about it, but I keep forgetting it because I don't keep tabs on it regularly.
Quick question from chat. Are you guys an optimist or pessimist? I don't know.
Well, I know
Agent Smith seems like very neutral to me.
I try to be neutral, but I'm probably a pessimist by nature. I imagine that you're an optimist. Would I be correct in assuming as much?
Yeah, I'm definitely optimist leaning. I believe that the human spirit is going to win out over the longer term, and that bad selfish action is more of a short-term strategy, and there are more of the long-term good steps that humans take that outlast the bad steps.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, short-term it can get pretty gnarly and bad. I definitely have shifted my perspective to be less trusting of people over the past 10 years. I had a very positive and sheltered childhood where very few bad things happened to me or my family directly.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really have much reason to distrust people. And I think I told you a few years back, we had I guess it was 2 years back, a guild betrayal where there were a couple officers who were trying to sort of hijack our operations and change the direction of our guild and lying to people and saying different stuff behind our backs and stuff.
Oh.
And that wasn't even on my radar whenever I was thinking about making a guild of like, well, what if we have people who are trying to backstab you and do a mutiny? I just wouldn't even expect that, but now I know. So anyone you try to backstab me, I am percentage more aware than I would have been.
Yeah. No, I hadn't known that about the drama. You were always kind of cagey about it. Didn't
Yeah.
know the details.
Yeah, whenever it's actively happening, I know that there are people in the guild who watch the stream and stuff, so I don't want to like just
Yeah,
reality TV put all of the cards on the table like that. But
yeah.
yeah, without dropping names, we had a couple officers who were very hardworking and really good at recruitment, and they wanted us to be a much more competitive guild than I was going for. My vision for the guild was that we were a bunch of adults who also have jobs and other obligations and stuff, but we wanted to experience the raids of Classic WoW. So I'm not expecting people to be on the game every day, working really hard on their character and then showing up and trying to be the best in the whole world. People have partners, they have kids, they have jobs, so I wanted to not push things too hard, but they wanted to go all the way because we have quite a few very skilled players who could be in a top guild. And what they were trying to do was recruit out our lowest performers with high performing players. So say there's just a friend in our friend group who maybe is in the 20 to 40th percentile for their class, and there's someone in trade chat who's in the 85th to 95th percentile. These officers would try to recruit specifically to swap out our lower performers for higher performers when some of those lower performers were like real life friends. And I valued the real life friendship over your in-game performance so long as we could still have a functional and solid raid. And I told them this, but it was just like every single weekend we would have a long debate about some issue that was ultimately related to that difference in vision. And then it got to the point where lies were being spread and they were saying stuff like people are about to mass quit the guild because of this. Unless you do what we're recommending you do, then it's all gonna go to shit and you're not gonna be able to do the next tier of content. So I did a survey and the results came back that people were generally pretty happy and things were working as intended. So ended up mass kicking them in all of their accounts. It was a really exciting day. Have you heard of the game Among Us?
I have.
It was a lot like that, where everyone does an emergency meeting who's in the officer corps except for those two. And we just like laid out all the evidence, let everyone kind of give their take and say their piece and stuff. And it was like, are they sus enough that they need to be yeeted off the ship? And the answer was yes. So it's like, okay, I'm going to go from A to Z. You go from Z to A. We're just going to boom, boom, boom. They did get voted out. Super voted out.
Wow. That's some court intrigue shit.
Yes, it is. But I never would have expected that because I was like, this is a video game for fun. Nobody cares that much to like do a mutiny betrayal. They do.
Wow.
People care about their WoW guild a lot. And it does involve a lot of people's time. And it happened at a really weird moment. So we got the original World of Warcraft like right when Corona hit. We get the COVID-19, so everyone's like inside all the time, and many people lost their job, and they lost their usual like friend outings and stuff, which meant that they wanted their WoW experience to be perfect because that's the only thing I can improve right now. Other stuff is just closed off to me at the moment, which meant that we had more pressure on us as leadership to make the experience fun and engaging when people were exhausted and tired and sick of quarantine and stuff like that. So really weird time for WoW to come back, but actually a good time because the game takes up so much heckin' time to get your characters raid ready and stuff.
Yeah.
Creation guild drama in a nutshell. We haven't really had an issue of that scale since then. Our officer corps has been very steady aside from that.
Oh, that's good, at least.
Yeah.
Politics of World of Warcraft. Who knew?
Yep. Definitely want to have people who you can trust. And it feels kind of, I don't know if it feels bad, but trust is earned with every action that the person does that is trustworthy. And trust is lost if they do stuff that breaks that, and it's way easier to lose trust than it is to build trust. Building trust takes a lot of consistency over time. Losing trust just requires like one lie that gets found out about, which is pretty fast.
Yeah. Yeah, the analogy I read online once is that it's like a piece of paper. So long as it's never folded, it's not an issue. But once it has been folded, it never really is able to return to its original shape.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, I did see some of the questions here. Somebody wanted me to comment on Sri Lanka. Yeah, I think we covered that last time. Was it 2 weeks ago?
Yeah. What's the short version for people who missed? They defaulted?
Yeah, well, they got hammered really hard by COVID-19 because tourism was a major industry for them. And so, obviously with the pandemic, tourism isn't a big thing, because of all the travel restrictions, and the inherent risk of being around people. So not nearly as many tourists around the world the past couple of years. So all of the tourist-dependent economies really got hurt, and Sri Lanka was among them. And then also there was a big collapse in commodity prices, which was a big deal for Sri Lanka because they are also a big exporter of tea. So that kind of hurt them as well. I think tea prices have recovered since then, but tourism has not. So they're still kind of hurting from that. And the economic issues that have been caused by that decline have persisted long enough that there's now something of a debt crisis. Well, not even really a debt crisis. I don't know that their debt is like all that big of a problem. More, it's a currency crisis. Because their exports have fallen so much over the past 2 years, their currency has devalued, and so that's made imports much more expensive. And so, I think everybody knows at this point that inflation is a problem, right? Like everybody feels that when they buy food, when they buy gasoline for their car, when stuff becomes more expensive, it's an issue. So Sri Lanka has been dealing with that problem as well. Inflation is global, but now they have the added inflation that comes from having all of your imports become more expensive because your currency devalues.
Mm-hmm.
So that's making that inflation problem much, much worse. So everything that was imported is now more expensive. And that's a problem because Sri Lanka imports a lot of stuff. It's not a modern economy, so they don't produce a whole lot of modern equipment or amenities of one sort or another that consumers want. They have to import most of that stuff. And a lot of it is now, even less accessible than it was before. And given that it's a developing country, a lot of people couldn't access it to begin with. So they've been trying to figure out little ways to get around the currency problem. They've been trying to restrict imports so that, well, I mean, basically the value of the currency can increase if they export more and if they import less. So one thing you can do is restrict imports. So that helps boost the value of the currency a little bit. They haven't blocked imports completely. They've just selectively restricted access to some types of foreign goods. And then, of course, you want to boost exports as much as possible. They tried to avoid paying out on a Chinese loan that they took out some years ago so that they could preserve the foreign currency. Because that's another thing you can do. You can buy your own currency with foreign currency reserves and try to artificially boost the value that way. So they were trying to avoid having to pay the loan, but then the Chinese government leaned on them and they basically ended up having to pay it out anyway, which didn't really help matters much. But yeah, that's the gist of it. They're just trying to figure out any kind of trick or, in the public policy playbook to try to stem the slide of the currency and try to return it to something resembling normal. That probably won't happen until tourism recovers, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. So they're kind of stuck. They're doing better than Lebanon. That's not a high bar, but they are doing better than Lebanon. In Lebanon, they had a very similar problem because tourism was a big deal for the Lebanese economy as well. But unlike with Lebanon, when they had a major financial problem with their currency as well as with their broader financial sector, the government didn't really do anything. In Lebanon, there was like a lot of resistance to being proactive about the problem because the political group, the different political factions in Lebanon were more interested in maneuvering against each other and trying to use the crisis against their enemies. So that made any kind of consensus on a solution to the problem impossible. And so the problem just kind of got worse and worse without the government really taking substantive action. It was one of the weirder public policy phenomenons I've seen. There's a crisis, but the government just doesn't respond to it. You don't see that a whole lot. But in Sri Lanka, the government actually did take action. It's been met with mixed success, but they are trying. So they've at least got that going for them.
Look, we're not responding to this problem well, but we are responding. So he asked that you please bear with us.
Yeah, I guess it's possible they may try to negotiate their debt down. Come to some kind of deal with China, for example, over all the money they borrowed from them in order to try to reduce and restructure the debt that they owe. So that could involve something like giving up assets or something. A lot of people who are concerned about Chinese ambitions abroad have been keeping an eye on that, but I don't think it's all that likely. China's not really in the adventuring business. The Belt and Road Initiative qualified. Certainly there was some ambition there, but it didn't really work out that well, and they've been cutting funding to that for the past couple of years now. So I don't think they think there's much to gain by being, aggressive and expansionist overseas. South China Sea notwithstanding, I don't think they're really out to build, foreign alliances and dependent states. They seem to be much more opportunistic. If they see an opportunity to make some gains in terms of like acquiring assets of some kind, they may do that. But I don't think there's going to be any overarching strategic impetus to it. They seem to be much more focused, at least in terms of governance, on governing China, which is difficult. Extremely so. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. And also, India has been a lot more proactive about engaging with Sri Lanka as well. India was kind of MIA in terms of regional diplomacy in some regards, Sri Lanka being the case in point. But over the past couple of years, they've been much more proactive about investing money in the country, making deals of, cooperation, basically, on a state-to-state level, to try to increase and improve ties between Sri Lanka and India so as to offset the Chinese influence. And the United States and some of the other regional actors have been doing that too. So overall, I don't think Sri Lanka is in danger of becoming any kind of like Chinese proxy per se. I don't think the danger was that great to begin with, but it's even less now, I would argue.
So cool. If you want to know more about Sri Lanka, see the previous Will Discussion with Agent Smith episode.
Yeah, we've talked about it before, too, because there was a lot of drama with the end of the Civil War against the Tamil Tigers. And so the Rajapaksa, who was president at the time and oversaw the end of the war, was very popular. But then he lost out against he lost power in the next election, shocking many, losing out to a guy who had been a former member of his party, but who broke away because he didn't like that Rajapaksa was not respecting human rights and was bending the law and, this kind of thing. He was that kind of sort of strong arm leader. And so you would think a guy like that, having ended the Civil War, would be, a shoo-in for re-election, but the reformist candidate actually won. Since then, the reformist candidate has lost popularity. So he's been replaced by Rajapaksa's brother, actually, whom is the current sitting president. So unfortunately, the reformists were not able to reform enough to warrant re-election, at least in the eyes of the Sri Lankan electorate. There was also problems with terrorism. There was that big bombing of a Christian church that also really hurt their credibility. Rajapaksa's family has always kind of cast themselves as the strong leaders capable of keeping the country safe. Ending the Civil War was a big feather in their cap in that regard. And so after the big terrorist attack, they argued that if they were in charge, it would have never happened because they would have been on top of it, which is probably not true, but a lot of people were willing to believe it. I think Sri Lanka is also where cinnamon comes from, or came from originally. Isn't that right? I'll ask Chad on this one.
I don't know.
I'm not going to pretend to know the answer.
I found
But
cinnamon
I
in the
think I remember
grocery
reading
aisle,
that.
but it was probably imported from somewhere.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's imported for sure. But like with individual spices, there's almost always a specific geography that they originated in.
Hmm.
And I think Sri Lanka was the original location of cinnamon, but maybe I'm wrong.
Have they figured out why kids love Cinnamon Toast Crunch yet?
I'm afraid not. I'm
Maybe.
afraid studies in that vein have been inconclusive.
Could it be that it's stacked with sugar?
Well, yeah, that's the real answer. The sugar is what keeps people coming back. Actually been cutting that down a bit lately.
Nice.
We'll see how long it lasts. It has more to do with me adhering to a rule not to eat after 9 p.m. But when your sleep schedule is kind of screwed up and you spend most of, that kind of constitutes the main part of your day, it kind of cuts back on your eating.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see what we had here. What sort of response do you think is warranted when Russia directly threatened all of NATO earlier today? Or maybe yesterday? Yeah, it's basically just cheap talk at this point. I don't think anybody takes it too seriously. It's kind of like North Korea. North Korea doesn't have a lot of cards to play, so they just act crazy and hope for the best. Russia is in a increasingly similar position diplomatically. Like their principal tool of influence was energy. But now a lot of European countries are cutting them out. Germany says they want to end natural gas and oil natural gas at least imports from Russia by the end of next year, I think it was. And they say they can cut it by as much as 2/3 by the end of this year. So unless Russia wants to try to cut them off early and cause a major economic crisis in Germany, if not other countries in Europe, then that means that Russia just doesn't have that tool anymore. So what do? Well, one thing you can do is to just issue death threats. If you keep doing the thing I don't like, then I'm going to kill you, or nuke you, or invade this piece of territory, or do something other distasteful. And, they probably won't follow through on those threats because they would get the worst of it if they actually did. But given the lack of alternatives, it's worth the gamble. Maybe the West will get tired of Ukraine, or maybe there will be a lot of political pressure to do something about inflation. So then, that forces governments to go in a different direction. There's things that can kind of happen. So Russia keeping the pressure on in that regard is not a surprise. But I wouldn't take it, again, too seriously. I don't think they're actually threatening to blow up Europe just because of Ukraine, rather. But as far as what the necessary response is, yeah, I mean, you can the little things, the little symbolic actions are generally what countries do in response to threatening cheap talk. So, the NATO forces have been deployed to the Baltic. Missile defense systems have been deployed to Poland and Romania. Some of that is to replace systems sent to Ukraine, but some of it is also just a signal to Russia that we're serious about defending NATO allies. So just little things like that, basically. Those are the things you do in response. Excuse me.
Yeah, they've been threatening stuff for basically the whole war, so it's not really anything new.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not concerned about it. They just don't know what else to do at this point. Like we've mentioned before, the war is as much a surprise to the Russian government as it is to everybody else. They really weren't expecting to have to actually fight. And it seems the expectation was an Iraq war style walkover. We'll be welcomed as liberators and the war will be over in a matter of weeks. Huzzah.
Mm-hmm.
It's going about as well for them as it went for the United States. Although, I guess to be fair to the United States, the actual conventional part of the war was a walkover. The Iraqi army was pretty well steamrolled in the first 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, it was a different problem of dealing with the insurgency after rather than being...
Yeah, it was that tricky bit afterwards. It's that pesky governance again, Neuro.
Yeah, governing is harder than taking over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the U.S. military is very good at breaking shit. That's kind of what they're designed to do. They're not really designed to piece back together countries that have a lot of conflicting interest groups, conflicting sectarian groups, ethnic groups. That's not really in their wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the discombobulation in Iraq and in the U.S. policy towards Iraq after the war is kind of explained by that. The United States had a tool that it tried to solve all its problems with, but that doesn't work. So you ended up with a gigantic clusterfuck.
Mm.
Yeah, Russia is having its Iraq right now. That's one way to interpret it. They thought it would be easy, and it ended up blowing up in their face. And I guess, it's to the credit of the U.S. military that they tried their best. They did try to learn lessons. They were adaptive. They tried to adjust to the situation on the ground as best they could. It was never really enough, just because the fundamental problem they faced was not really military, but political, and militaries are not meant to solve political problems.
Yeah.
At least outside of war. I guess you can consider war, a political problem, but let me rephrase. Militaries are not designed to settle political differences. Certainly not domestically.
Mm-hmm.
But they did try. There was a pretty big body of literature amongst officers, and the military science community trying to figure out counterinsurgency. They had all these little schemes and plans and approaches, and it seemed like they had, a new major approach like every other year or maybe even every year. But it just, again, fundamentally, you cannot have a violent solution to a problem like what there was in Iraq. You can try to build democratic institutions, but it takes more than the overthrow of a previous government to do that. It takes a lot of software in terms of like institutional software, like institutions that are well designed and manned by people that actually want them to work and don't try to exploit them. And that legacy of ethnic rivalry between the Kurds and the Arabs and the problems between the Shia and the Sunni, that's hard in the best of circumstances to deal with. And I don't think the United States was ever really going to get control of that.
Yeah, another thing that we talked about as a general concept is norms changing for a country and how that's more of a glacial change rather than hey, we're going to swoop in here and just let you know how to do government and you can just follow this plan and you'll be fine. They basically have the inertia of what's been done in the past. And as soon as you leave, that's the next thing that they're going to try to do again, is what they have been doing for the past several decades.
Yeah.
You can't really skip a whole bunch of different stages of development, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what they were trying to do. I remember reading about there was one approach in Afghanistan, and they called it government in a box. They were going to try to bring Afghanistan a modern government in a box along with modern institutions, and they would try to install that and train people to run it, but it didn't work. You just can't, you can change the political infrastructure, but you really can't change the political culture, at least not overnight.
Mm-hmm.
We were there for 20 years. That was more than overnight, but we never really had a plan for changing the political culture. Maybe if we'd taken more of a long-term approach rather than just consecutive short-term approaches, maybe that would have changed things. But that's Monday morning quarterbacking on my part. Who's to say? Maybe nothing would have worked. Maybe it was just inevitable that it was going to fail the way it did. Maybe the real problem was trying to build a modern country in the first place. Maybe it would have been better just to cut a deal with local elites and then try to cooperate on issues of common interest rather than just trying to reshape the country from the ground up. But like I pointed out before, there wasn't really much alternative either. If the United States had invaded Afghanistan and then installed a pro-American, puppet government by allying with local elites of one kind or another, people would have lost their shit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much people remember that era, but there was always a lot of consternation, especially after especially during the Cold War, but including after, about the United States government overthrowing other countries' governments and installing puppet governments, and especially attacking leftists. That was a big deal, especially in Latin America. So there was some concern amongst that part of the political spectrum that really hated that period of American history, that the United States might use the war on terrorism as an excuse to do the same again.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of pressure on the Bush administration to do otherwise. So, in their defense, if they had actually, done something different other than trying to restructure the government and allow it to be democratic and representative, they would have been in a lot of trouble with that part of the political spectrum. They were already on bad terms anyway. The tax cuts that the Bush administration passed, and the whole conservative outlook on the culture wars. That kind of rubbed a lot of people on the left the wrong way in the first place. But going with like an old school Kissinger style realpolitik approach to the war on terror, that would have created way more problems. But to kind of bring this full circle, the United States military tried to adapt, did the best they could, and they did a decent job considering the shit circumstances that the government put them in. But the Russian military and the Russian government don't seem to be doing that. They don't seem to be learning institutions, so to speak. They seem to be really trying to do the same thing over and over again.
You also have the difference between like the general military part, like you mentioned, which you can just look at the raw execution of what was the objective for the military and how is their execution in pursuit of that objective, setting aside any like ethical or moral questions about like, was this a good idea? But the execution of the US was a lot tighter for at least what they were setting out to do for taking the territory. For this one, it seemed like it was a really last minute surprise, and if you're surprising yourself with an attack, it prevents you from like really winding up a lot of momentum. The pieces were more or less on the board there, but if the soldiers were actually lied to and told that it was only going to be an exercise and then they go invade, you're sending in confused people into the fray rather than like the early aughts for the US was more of like a we need to fight the terrorists, and that was, while it's kind of a flawed reason, it was at least clear, and it had some momentum building up from 9/11. So there were a lot of people who were upset and they wanted to see something done about the problem, like unseating Saddam Hussein. That's not really addressing 9/11 at all, but it was something that the energy could be projected toward.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a similar dynamic in Russia. There's a lot of grievance politics amongst nationalist Russians regarding things like NATO expansion,
Mm-hmm.
among other issues. There's a whole list of things that Russia and the West have been confronting each other over the past couple decades. But NATO expansion is definitely sort of near the top of the list. So there's already a lot of people in Russia that were willing to believe the government's line on Ukraine. It made it pretty easy to lead them into war.
Mm-hmm.
I think it may be rather more difficult to lead them out, given how badly things have gotten. But yeah, similar to Iraq in the sense that there was a ready-made constituency that was gung-ho for a conflict, albeit for reasons that weren't necessarily related to the reasons that originally drove them to be gung-ho. Well, let's see. When will the war end, or will it turn into World War III? It's not going to turn into World War III because having tried to figure out which countries are implementing sanctions, I'm still working on the economic fallout project as far as the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict. But one of the things I've noticed is that the developing world really doesn't give a shit. Like, they're not interested in being involved in this. They hate the fact that they're impacted at all.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not really participating in sanctions. And if they're not participating in sanctions, I have a hard time believing they're going to jump into some kind of war that might break out between Russia and the rest of Europe. So even if things did escalate and there was a war between Europe and Russia, I don't think that the rest of the world would get involved. It probably would just be a European war at that point. And Europe would probably get pretty thoroughly fucked up, since there's a decent chance that it would escalate to at least tactical nuclear weapons. And that fact alone is yet another reason, the rest of the world doesn't want to get involved. As much as people around the world may sympathize with Ukraine, I don't think anybody really wants to get nuked for them. So that fact alone will probably limit any potential escalation just to Europe. But that said, as far as how long the war will last, that's a much more difficult question. It's going to depend on probably who gets exhausted faster. Ukraine in that regard has an advantage because it has the modern world, basically on its side. North America, Western Europe, if not the European Union as a whole, and Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, that's a pretty good list of allies to have. In terms of economic output, that's pretty ballin'.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not going to hurt for money or equipment or supplies, at least not in the short to medium term. But the issue there, though, is that publics in those countries could get tired of the conflict. It's making natural gas and other things more expensive. And people may just get distracted by other things. So if that happens, then support could slide, and if support slides, that could create conditions more favorable to Russia to actually achieve some of its goals in Ukraine. But on the other hand, at the same time, all of the sanctions are putting a lot of economic pressure on Russia, so it could be that they end up collapsing. Well, not collapsing per se, but their war effort could end up collapsing. It could just be that the cost benefit doesn't make any sense and they just leave. Declare victory and go home, so to speak.
Yeah. And in that case of like declaring victory and going home, they would probably want to list some objectives that make them look victorious, at least in that effort. Like maybe they just try to argue for the territory in the east, or say that they changed the local population enough that it is now denazified, to use their terminology there. Mm-hmm. Where at least some of the people who were in support of the war can feel like something of value was done, while at the same time like making an excuse to leave.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, when do you think it will end was the...
When do I think it'll end? Yeah, right. Yeah, who gets exhausted first? And it's still early, so it's not clear who that's going to be, really. I think most of the smart money is probably on Russia getting tired first. But They could drag things out for several more months if they want to. The Ukrainian army still isn't strong enough to push Russia out of their territory, or at least I don't think so. Maybe they'll surprise us again. But that means that Russia has the advantage of being able to just sit on the territory it's taken thus far and using that as a negotiating chip. So that also puts the West in an awkward position, because the West was expecting to just support a Ukrainian insurgency. They didn't think they'd actually be propping up a major combatant in a conventional war. And so that puts them in the awkward position where they have to kind of decide how much they want to support Ukraine's war effort. Like, we could support them just enough to keep them in the fight, but that's different than giving them enough equipment to actually be able to win. And giving them enough equipment to win is itself different than giving them enough equipment and support and whatever else they need to actually push the Russians out of their territory.
Mm-hmm.
You know, victory for Ukraine doesn't necessarily have to include liberating all of the occupied territory. You know, I mean, at this point, winning could just be keeping what they have thus far, which, given poor expectations at the start of the war, is pretty exceptional in and of itself. So we could just give them enough support to do that. But we could also be ambitious and give them, you know, the whole kit and caboodle, basically, you know, all of the weapons and equipment they could dream of, and all of the trained personnel they need to man it, so that they can actually fight the Russian military on an even keel and eject them from their territory. But that's going to take longer. You know, if the West expects the war to be long, like maybe a year, if not longer, then it makes sense to do that. But if the war is going to be over in a couple months because one or the other side collapses, well, again, one of the other side's war efforts collapses, then long-term projects like, you know, training projects for, you know, new equipment, new modern Western equipment don't make as much sense. So I guess part of it has to do with expectations in that sense, but also desire. Like, how much money do you really want to spend on it? How much do you want to get involved? How much do you want to risk escalation? You know, those are also some concerns at play. I think the United States is relatively risk averse. You know, we've been sending lots of stuff for sure, and we've been very proactive, sharing intelligence and other things that are very useful for the Ukrainians. But fundamentally, my sense is that the Biden administration is not that interested in the conflict, and that's basically been government policy not only for the Biden administration, but also for the Trump and Obama administrations as well. Like, there really wasn't all that much interest in Ukraine for a long time, to the point where the United States was kind of de facto recognizing Ukraine as part of the Russian sphere of influence. You know, just the degree of disinterest kind of implicitly suggested the United States was not willing to really take any big risks or take on any major projects to help Ukraine. So the Biden administration is no different in that regard. You know, they didn't really want to take any big risks at the start or send a lot of support at the start, but when Europe started doing it, then they fell into line. You know, the US interest in Ukraine basically begins and ends with the perceived threat to Europe. You know, European allies, the United States has an obligation to defend its allies in Europe. And if they feel threatened by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then there is some implicit obligation there to take some actions as they see necessary to ensure their security. So the United States is willing to do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean helping Ukraine win the war. It just means hobbling Russia's war effort and making sure that there's a precedent set to deter any potential future aggression on the part of either Russia or any other potential aggressors around the world. So the United States has basically just been following Europe in that regard. You know, if Europe is willing to escalate their involvement, the US will, but I don't think that the United States is going to do it on its own either. I don't think there's enough strategic imperative there for the United States. But we'll see. Maybe the Europeans will surprise us and they'll actually get ambitious and try to do what's necessary to get Ukraine back its territory. I'm a little skeptical. The German government isn't really known for being that gung-ho about foreign policy, so they're probably going to be more interested in reaching some kind of negotiated settlement. But the trouble with that approach is that neither combatant in the war really has an incentive to do that right now. Russia doesn't want to be embarrassed, so they want to try to push harder to get some kind of gain that they can point to for the war effort. And Ukraine, for their part, is, you know, doing very well. And they, of course, want to try to liberate as much territory as possible, if not all of it. And so, given that they have momentum, why quit? Why quit while you're ahead, so to speak?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think the German approach there is going to work. I think they're either going to have to really back Ukraine more, or they're going to have to cut support or threaten to cut support to try to pressure the Ukrainian government into giving more concessions or giving the concessions necessary to get some kind of peace deal that returns things to something resembling the status quo ante. The French, for their part, almost elected a government that didn't give a shit about it explicitly. So, I don't know how much political capital Macron has to really jump into Ukraine with both feet. I think Ukraine's best hope is Eastern Europe, because there's a lot of Eastern European countries that are still butthurt about, all the murder under the communist governments. Understandably so. So they don't really like the idea of an aggressive Russia on their border. So they're much more willing to expend whatever is necessary and take whatever risks are necessary to ensure that Russia at least gets a bloody nose, if not outright is ejected from Ukraine and loses the war outright. So, Poland and the Baltic states in particular are big cheerleaders for Ukraine in that regard. Yeah, we'll see. It's just an open question. It just depends on a lot of factors regarding economic support, political support in the West, and how facts on the ground change.
Well, it seems to have gone differently than we initially expected, though. I think a lot of people expected the walkover win for Russia, kind of like the U.S. in Iraq.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. But to bring this full circle, the guy was asking, when will the war end? So I think best guess, a couple more months. I think that's probably about how long it'll take for things to kind of settle into an equilibrium, basically, where one side will have taken as much as it's going to take. And at that point, there's going to be some prolonged, arduous negotiations that are going to be really difficult and are probably going to require some hard to swallow concessions by both sides. There's an outside chance that, Russia just feels the economic pressure to the point where they're willing to give up a lot more. So in that case, the negotiations could be much more brief. But I don't know how long that's going to take. Like the Russians were fortifying their economy against sanctions after 2014, specifically so that they would be more resilient to this. They're not looking particularly resilient economically because they were surprised. Again, they weren't expecting to have the full weight of the modern world again, drop a full package of sanctions on them, or to seize, their foreign reserves as they existed outside of Russia. That in particular surprised them. So it's kind of made them look unprepared. But actually, they have been preparing for something like this for a long time. And we've kind of seen with the stabilization of the Russian economy, some of the fruits of that labor. They have been able to kind of mitigate the damage somewhat. So if there's going to be a major economic breakdown, it's probably going to be more in the long term, like within the next year or maybe longer. If sanctions are so prolonged, then they'll probably start having more significant problems. But in the meantime, I think they've got enough stopgaps policy-wise that they can implement to kind of delay Armageddon, so to speak. So I don't think economic pressure will end the war, basically, within the next couple months. I think it's more likely it'll end within the next couple months for political reasons. Like if Ukraine feels like foreign support is starting to ebb, they may prefer to go to the negotiating table to try to get what they can before the Russians start making progress again. But on the other hand, the Russians themselves are having political issues. The Russian government is very much in the driver's seat as far as its hold on power. Like they're not too worried about people like rising up. But one of the few things that'll get people in an authoritarian society riled up is a fall in the standard of living. Even the Russians, who are vaunted for their ability to endure suffering on the part of the motherland, will grumble if they don't feel like their suffering is warranted.
Mm-hmm.
So for the moment, they're not having to suffer all that much. And a lot of the expectation seems to be that the West will get tired and quit. so they won't have to suffer for much longer. So if that's proven to be incorrect, and they actually do have to face a prolonged Western sanctions regime that substantively reduces their quality of life and does so for the indefinite future, that changes the underlying political calculus in Russia. And at that point, you could start seeing some discontent amongst people who have not traditionally shown much discontent towards the Putin government. So that could take anywhere from, 6 months to a year, let's say, just a random figure off the top of my head. If it's going to be economic problems forcing them to the table, 6 months to a year, more likely political factors within the next couple months. I guess I should specify its expectations. Economic factors could just hobble the economy 6 months to a year, but within the next couple months, if the Russian government expects that to happen substantively, then that becomes a political calculus rather than economic calculus, which is why I said it's political rather than economic. I should drink coffee so I'm more awake for these.
Coffee before bed, though?
Yeah, not the smartest, but then I can play Stellaris all night again, I guess.
Well, are we working on the sleep schedule, or are we working on the Empire and Stellaris? We cannot do both.
I'm gonna go with sleep schedule tonight. That's the plan.
But you could wake up at 6 a.m. and play Stellaris.
I feel like at that point I would just have a problem. That's like drinking in the morning or something like that.
Yeah.
Like if you do it in moderation, it's fine. But if you're doing it at 6 a.m., that's probably a bad sign. That's probably the point at which you should be asking for some assistance. So no, I don't think I'll be doing it at 6 a.m. I'll try not to anyway. That's the objective. So let's see here. Oh, thank you. Following me on Twitter, reading the articles. Hopefully they're worthwhile reading. I try to pick stuff that I think is interesting. My question is, how will the China-Solomons Island Pact that was signed recently affect our region? Should we be concerned? I want to say no, and that's what I said last week. I still think, in general, I wouldn't worry about it much. But I would add the caveat that whether or not to worry about it is going to depend entirely on how the Australian government responds to it. Because they need to respond intelligently and with some, deft, subtle diplomacy here. This is a kind of problem that's easy to fuck up. Not to be overly crass about it, but it's easy to screw up. So you need to think about it, and that's troublesome because Australia really hasn't had to think about its region that much. I haven't followed Oceania, which apparently is how it's pronounced. I was pronouncing it Oceania the last time, and people in chat were like, I don't think that's correct. So I double checked it, and you're right. It is actually Oceania, apparently.
It's Oceania,
I haven't
not
followed
no,
it super
Oceania.
Sorry?
Oceania, not Oceana.
Oh, I was still getting it wrong. Okay, Oceania. My apologies.
Let me check. How is it spelled? It's in the question?
No, it's not in the question, but I was just bringing it up to make a point that I haven't been following it closely, but my impression is that Australia hasn't had to worry about Oceania that much, which is its maybe not quite sphere of influence, but it's its neighborhood, so it's of concern for them. So keeping tabs on it hasn't required like creative diplomacy on their part. They could just kind of phone it in, do the same thing they've always been doing, etc. So now that there actually is a problem and that it does require some deft diplomacy, I'm a little curious to see if they have the capability to do it. So on the one hand, I expect them to take the problem seriously and to address it as such, but I'm a little concerned maybe they're a little rusty and maybe they find a way to screw it up. And at that point, China has something resembling an ally in their immediate vicinity, which is going to be a strategic issue for them in the long run. Although, that said, I don't know how valuable a strategic asset the Solomon Islands is going to be to China. Like, unless the Solomon Islands lets them build like a full-on military base there, if not multiple military bases, and allow the Chinese to station forces there and also to project force from those bases. Uh, assuming the Solomon Islands isn't willing to do that, then it's probably not going to be that big a deal because it's a weak country, it's small, they don't have a lot of resources, and they know that ties to Australia are important for them. There's a lot of trade with Australia. Australia has a lot of institutional connections. Technically, there are Australian troops in the Solomon Islands right now, helping the government deal with unrest. So that suggests that the relationship is still important to them, even if the Solomon Islands government is kind of reaching out to diversify its relationships. So I wouldn't worry about it too much just because the Solomon Islands isn't going to like let themselves become like a full-on proxy. I think they're just trying to make some gains here by playing one or the other power off against each other. So
Yeah,
long as
it's kind of like looking for a competing offer for a job just to jack up your salary that you end up getting. You might not even
yeah,
necessarily want that, but if you show the other that you're in demand, then that means that they want to prioritize you more.
exactly. It's what you would call a dark horse. No, not a dark horse, a stalking horse. It's a negotiating term. So, you try to improve your negotiating position by making your counterparty believe that there's a third party involved who's offering something more attractive. The implicit threat being that she'll drop the negotiations and go with the mystery third party. And of course, the third party may not even exist. You're just kind of bringing them up to improve your position. So that's called a stalking horse. And so in the case of the Solomon Islands, China is their stalking horse. They're nominally improving their relationship and improving strategic and economic ties. But I don't think that's because they just want a full-throated embrace of China. I think it's because they're trying to pressure Australia into giving them more concessions on issues of concern.
The questioner is saying that the islands agreed to the military base and accepted the offer to station police and peacemakers.
Now, I haven't heard about any military base,
Is
so
that
maybe that's
new?
new.
That
What
could
I
be.
did hear about is that they would allow the deployment of Chinese troops to help them suppress dissent. Well, not dissent, but to help them suppress and deal with unrest in the country. But that's not really any different than the kind of agreement they have with Australia in that regard. So that's not the same thing as stationing Chinese military forces there, any more than there's permanent Australian military presence there. That was my reading of it anyway. And they also said that they would allow the Chinese Navy to visit ports in the Solomon Islands if they want. But again, that's not the same thing as permanently stationing forces there. So unless there's some new part of the agreement that I wasn't aware of, I don't think it's true that they're actually allowing full-on military bases and stationing of Chinese forces there. I'm pretty sure if that were true, then the United States and Australia would be absolutely apoplectic. Apoplectic. I'm probably mispronouncing that too.
For the
Um,
Zoomers, they would be big mad.
yeah, there you go. Let's go with that. That's probably more understandable. Yeah, as is, the Australian response hasn't been such that they've been freaking out, like they suddenly have a major strategic rival on their doorstep. It's been more like, oh, I have to think about this now. That's been my impression anyway. But if I'm wrong, then please give me a source on that, and I'd love to read about it. I don't want to make an ass out of myself any more than I usually do on here. So, by all means, correct me. Let's see. That's all we had for the questions from this week. We did have some from last time we didn't get to.
Sure, let's get them.
Do you think that a binary world order will emerge as a result of the need to protect Eastern powers from U.S. sanctions? Or will U.S. hegemony prevail for the foreseeable future? See, this is a tricky question. Because, yes, there is an incentive there to kind of bifurcate the world into, Western democracies and Eastern autocracies, but I don't really see it happening. Because for one, those are not coherent blocks. Like a lot of the allies that the United States and even Europe has are not really themselves liberal democracies. You can look at the Gulf monarchies in the Middle East as being a case in point. So I don't think that liberal democracies by themselves would be a strong enough bloc in the first place. If they did do that, then they would immediately basically just create a super bloc of autocracies consisting of every country outside of the liberal democracy bloc. And that's not a winning formula. So I don't think it's even an attractive position from the Western perspective. But also from the Eastern perspective, it doesn't make sense because in order to have a coherent bloc of autocracies, they would need to actually cooperate with each other. And it seems pretty clear they don't really want to do that. The Ukraine war is a clear case in point. Like the support China is giving to Russia in the war has been pretty minimal. They're not going to bat for them as though they're close strategic allies who are about to lead an autocratic bloc in a new Cold War. They're just acting like they usually do, which is opportunistically and self-interestedly. So I don't think then, given that evidence, that there's much impetus there for either of the major leaders of the world, in the West or in China or Russia, to engage in that kind of competition in the first place, or even really to want to. It would be enormously expensive to no discernible gain. It would just create a lot of waves and instability that would upset the established elites and all parties involved. So I don't think that's coming. So I think, will U.S. hegemony persevere in the near to medium term? Probably. That gets into another conversation, though. I mean, the general impression people have is that the United States is in decline. But I think it's important to point out that that decline is relative. It's declining relative to what it was before because other countries are becoming more powerful. But in absolute terms, the United States is more powerful now than it's ever been. The institutional reach of U.S. institutions is, massive and growing even. The FDA, for example, is like basically the food and I remember the drug testing agency of the world, so to speak. A lot of countries depend on rulings from the FDA to determine what kinds of food products are safe. They reference European agencies too, but the United States the FDA is among them that they reference, and the U.S. is the de facto drug enforcement agency of the world. Nobody else really has the capacity or reach to do that on a global level like the United States does. And the U.S. economy has evolved. I mean, obviously, it hasn't evolved a lot of opportunities for people of a particular skill set. But if you look at the big picture, the U.S. is pretty well killing it. Like the United States economy has basically evolved to the point where the U.S. is now the upper middle class neighborhood of the global community. We have a disproportionately massive share of the world's IT jobs, as well as management jobs and finance jobs and all the other like high paying type jobs there are in a modern economy. So we don't just have jobs that produce those kinds of goods and services for the US economy, we basically produce them for the entire planet. And that's created a just massively unbalanced job market where the US has a very weirdly large share of its income in the upper bracket, the upper middle class bracket. I'm sure critics would point out that we also have a larger share in the lower bracket at this point than we had before, and that's true too. But if you compare like the proportion of people who in the job market who have upper middle class incomes or higher, then what you'll see is that the United States has a percentage that's more on par with city-states like Singapore or Monaco than it does with equivalent countries in like France, in Europe, like France or Germany or the UK. And that's very like strange, statistically speaking. It's impressive, but it's weird. And I think that just speaks to the degree to which the American competitive advantage has not monopolized, but definitely disproportionately concentrated huge chunks of the global upper middle class type jobs into itself. So the US economy is doing very good in absolute terms. Again, there's issues, but in absolute terms, doing very well. Politically, there's obviously it's a bit wonky because of all the waves that have been made by populist unrest and culture wars and all this kind of thing. But that said, if you can look beyond, the deadlock in the legislature, administrative agencies are doing relatively well as well. They have their problems too, but they've evolved to a point where they're able to pretty consistently deliver good governance to the country. So, yeah, problems, but overall, the US is actually doing pretty good, and we have very strong cards to play diplomatically, economically, and politically. If our politics weren't so just such a dumpster fire, we would be able to play those cards much better and with much more alacrity. But that aside, the fact remains that we still have a lot of influence in the world. And we can kind of see that in cases like with the trade war with China or the response to the war in Ukraine. Some people, especially in China and Russia, were of the mind that they would easily be able to win those kinds of confrontations, and it hasn't happened that way. There was no collapse in the U.S. GDP because the trade war happened, like some people predicting. I thought there would be much more disruption from the trade war with China, for example, just because there were so many linkages and they were so complex. I didn't really think anybody would be able to counter the headwinds that would be generated. But the headwinds ended up being relatively mild. Partly that was because of tariff invasion. Lots of Chinese firms found ways to maintain access to the US market, but also it was because just a lot of people just swallowed the increase in costs that resulted. So the US economy has been sufficiently resilient, or maybe more accurately, the global economy, that the trade war just didn't land that much. And then with Russia, there was a lot of talk about, commodities and the dependence on Russian commodities in Europe, stopping any kind of progress there. But they were very resilient to that. And well, we're talking about the United States. I should focus on that. Um, there was some concern that the United States wouldn't actually care that much. That was generally my position. I didn't really think the United States would respond that strongly. I knew there would be a strong response in terms of like sanctions and stuff like that, but I was pleasantly surprised by the degree to which not only the US government, but the American public has been willing to sacrifice on behalf of Ukraine. Maybe that'll change. It's still a conflict on the other side of an ocean that people are not really that directly tied to. But for the moment, anyway, there's a lot of public support for them. So kudos there for the US public.
We like our freedom fighters, and they were just basically sitting at home doing Ukrainian things. And there's a lot of overlap, especially in the labor force. I've talked with some people who just work in like a software development country, and a whole bunch of their talent is in Ukraine. So the integration between the US and the Ukraine is much higher than many other countries, which also do have active conflicts that we could have a stake in, but we're relatively more interested because we're more connected.
Yeah. Yeah, the interdependency and interconnectivity has definitely worked to their advantage. And that, of course, is now, improving as a result of the conflict and the need to coordinate. So certainly that's an advantage for them. My brain is not cooperating. How did we get onto that?
There was a question about Solomon Islands. Was that the one that we got here from? Or I think this was a last week
binary
question. Oh,
no,
yeah.
The U.S. hegemony, that's what it was.
Well, we have two spheres of influence.
Yeah.
Two clear ones.
No, I think U.S. hegemony will continue for the near to medium term. And yeah, that's what I was doing. I was trying to highlight why I thought that was the case, and it's because of all the economic advantages, institutional advantages, etc. So, there's still a lot to recommend the United States, even if it is in relative decline.
There are some people in the chat who are talking about wealth disparity and just kind of clarifying what ours is like compared to other countries. I think we have a pretty strong middle class, but we also have a lot of the super duper elites who have a shitload of money.
Yeah, that's where the inequality really comes out. There was There's a couple things that happened. I guess the question isn't why did it happen, but yeah, that there is a lot of inequality in the United States, much more so than in other developed countries, even. And we also do less about it than other developed countries. Weaker welfare states, weaker supports, weaker, uh, maybe not weaker education spending. We actually spend a lot on that, but fewer opportunities, let's say. We don't spend as much on like technical schools, like say the Germans do, to offer alternatives to people who don't want to, go to college and go that route. So yeah, I think the Europeans are smarter about offering a more robust and a more comprehensive set of public supports for its citizens than the United States is. But that said, the United States makes different trade-offs that result in the economy being more dynamic and allowing more flexibility and opportunities for people. Sometimes those opportunities are better than others. I don't think people working in an Amazon warehouse really think of themselves as being particularly privileged to be having the opportunity to work there. I'm sure they would prefer to have circumstances that were more amenable, more work support, more unemployment support, more educational support, etc. But yeah, as far as why the inequality is there was a period starting in probably the 60s or so in which there was a rapid development of modern technology, computer technology, semiconductors, stuff like that. And that had knock-on effects, creating new products like, the personal computer, for example, which was actually a really cool, innovative piece of technology when it was first created. Computers used to fill up a whole room. They were just these big machines, and they were so expensive that really only big institutions could afford to buy them. Universities, government agencies, groups like that. So the idea that you could have a computer small enough to just have in your home, pretty cool. And that was a really neat trick that they pulled to develop that. So what happened is there was that whole arc of technological development starting with semiconductors and other things, and then the personal computers, and then the internet, and etc. So that all started roughly in the 60s. And then, like we were talking about before, kind of a callback here, there was that period of deregulation that started in the 1980s. So those two factors combined created a very dynamic environment for that technological innovation to happen, and that resulted in the rapid development of whole new industries and markets. And invariably, what happens when you have the rapid growth of new industries, and more specifically, new businesses, is that you end up with people making massive fortunes, and generally, it's a pretty small number of people. People talk about how much money Bill Gates has, but most of that money was not earned by income, like revenue from Microsoft. Most of his money he made just from the massive explosion in the value of Microsoft itself, the value of the company that he helped found. Just because business grew so much, the company in turn grew so much, and its valuation was in, the billions and billions of dollars. And so that was his money. And so when he sold his stake in that, I don't think he sold all of it, but I think he sold a good chunk of it. He was able to, what's the word, actualize that. That's, I don't know the proper financial term for what you liquidated, let's say. When he liquidated the assets so that he could get the cash, then he became cash rich. But before that, he was asset rich. So that's how most billionaires are made. They don't make it because they do stuff that they get paid billions of dollars for. Rather, they become rich because they start a business that grows so rapidly that it becomes immensely valuable, such that they can sell it and become billionaires. Oh, God, how did I get onto that?
Income disparity.
Income disparity. Thank you. Thank you
Why?
for being my memory, Neuro.
Why are the rich so rich?
Yeah, so that's why. That's the deregulation created an environment where people could, kind of dominate, could start a new business very easily and could dominate a new industry very rapidly. And so the rapid increase in valuation produced a new cohort of billionaires, basically. And because technological innovation has been happening so rapidly, there's been successive iterations of that process, creating whole new industries and new billionaires in turn. Yeah, if you look at like the second industrial revolution in like the late 19th century, the same thing happened. There was just a rapid development of new technologies that resulted in whole new industries. And generally, those industries were dominated by just a few firms. Generally, there was a lot of new firms in those industries at first, but then a couple of those firms would become, were the most competitive and they would dominate the market. And so then whoever owned those firms would end up becoming enormously rich. So, things like railroads, for example, or electricity or stuff like that. This is where you get like the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan and some of the old money families in the United States that are actually still around. That's how they made their money originally. But what happens in the long term is that a lot of those families will kind of divest over time. They try to diversify their portfolios, and eventually, the corporations, the major businesses that they found that dominate those new industries, they kind of wither over time. Generally they become publicly traded companies, and they behave like, you know, prototypical large publicly traded companies. In other words, they kind of become slow. They don't innovate as much. They focus more money on I don't know what's it, not derivatives, dividends. There we go. So, when your stock doesn't grow that much, that doesn't mean that the company collapses. It generally means that the company will take, well, generally it means that the company is very large. So generally what they'll do is they'll take money from their revenue and they'll just give it back to shareholders in the form of dividends. And so that's a way of making up for the lack of growth in the value of the stock. So they don't die, but they do just kind of enter a slow long-term decline. And eventually they'll reach a point where they'll start divesting themselves of certain businesses that they own. So I think General Electric has been doing that lately. General Electric grew and grew for decades and became this giant conglomerate that owned lots of stuff. But then more recently, they kind of tapped out. They just kind of, well, not tapped out, but they capped out how much they could realistically grow with their current model. And so they've decided to focus more on growth industries among those that they own. And those that are sort of stagnating or shrinking, they've sold those off and spun those off into new companies that are going to chart a different course going forward. So the main company is basically narrowing down. And, that's just part of the natural evolution of a corporation. So that's what's going to happen with Microsoft and Apple and, these other companies. Right now, they're still at an earlier phase where they're dominating new markets and new industries, but those industries will mature over time, and they'll either, evolve with them and stagnate eventually, or they'll find new businesses to innovate and shift into, in which they can generate the growth that they need, or at least the want anyway. So yes, there's lots of billionaires, but eventually, if there's not further technological innovation at a similarly rapid pace anyway, there probably won't be another cohort quite like the one that sprouted up in the 80s and 90s. Because again, the rapid period of technological intervention with the period of deregulation together is what prompted it. And while we still have the deregulation, technological innovation isn't necessarily going to continue to be quite as explosive, to offer as many opportunities. There's only so many ways you can reinvent the wheel on the internet. eBay, for example, put auctions online. Facebook put social media online. There's different services that used to be offline that you can adapt to the online world. But that's kind of running its course. Like there's all of the things that you used to be able to do only offline. You can pretty much do all of that online now. So it's not entirely clear what future avenues of growth there are. Now it seems like more of the growth is in algorithms and helping social media companies try to better sell stuff. In that sense, it's more about advertising. So maybe something like electric vehicles. We talked before about industrial policy and how environmentalism is going to be a big part of the economic conversation going forward. So there could be some opportunities there. But it's more likely, I think, that the existing automotive companies are going to probably adapt and dominate that market. Certainly, there's some upstarts like Tesla, for example, that are going to challenge that hegemony. But some of the other companies just have such a big advantage in terms of expertise, established supply chains, established infrastructure, I think even with all the progress Tesla has been made, it'll be challenging for them to actually dominate the market for electric vehicles in the long run. But we'll see. And I'm not an expert on the topic anyway, so, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's my own reading anyway. But yeah, that's quite the tangent from US hegemony.
Yeah, we do tangents well here at World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah.
It's one of our best selling points, actually.
Okay, so if I ever don't answer a question to somebody's satisfaction, please do feel free to ask again and elaborate more or point out what I missed, because sometimes I miss the gist of it. So let's see. So I'm going to move on. Has the CIA ramped up aggressive action against China? Probably. I wouldn't know. That's the real answer. I'm not in the CIA, and I haven't read much evidence of contemporary CIA operations in China. The big thing I know about the CIA in China is that they had just an utter catastrophe happen to them and their network in China around, what was it, like 2012 or 2011 or so. Their network was basically compromised because of a technological problem. They didn't update their software pretty much. They had some special software they developed to allow secret clandestine communication between CIA handlers and some of their people in the Chinese government. But I know there was something to do with like the software obsolescing, like the Chinese counterintelligence agents were able to kind of pick up on it because of a flaw in the program. And so that resulted in the Chinese intelligence agency basically just rolling up that network very quickly. And it was a hugely comprehensive network. I mean, it was a hugely comprehensive roll up. Like they got pretty much all of the major assets the CIA had. And so that pretty much collapsed the CIA's presence in China for a long time. I imagine they've recovered to some degree since then, but I couldn't say the degree to which that would be the case. Not having insider information on the subject. I'm sure they've been active in the cybersphere. Certainly the Chinese government is, so I'd be surprised if the CIA weren't doing a little tit for tat on that count. But yeah, beyond that, I don't know how much else or what else the CIA could do. There's hacking, and there's trying to pick up and cultivate new assets. But beyond that, I don't know what they would be doing. It's not an open society, right? So you can't. It's kind of hard to inculcate unrest unless you're working with the Falun Gong anyway. Maybe they could do it, but that would come with knock-on effects. An unstable China is going to have repercussions for the global economy. So certainly, while it would inhibit any ambitions they might have outside China, the cure could be worse than the disease in that case, from a strategic perspective. But yeah, short answer is probably. I would assume that they're taking more action, but I can't really tell you. Well, I couldn't really tell you, even if I wanted to, just what kind of aggressive action they might be taking. Yeah, people think of the CIA as being like this sexy spy agency with that goes on adventures and tries to overthrow governments and do all that kind of thing. But actually, it's really a lot more nerdy than that, as I understand it. A lot of the stuff they do is just write reports, intelligence analysis and stuff by gathering up information from not only Human, but also Sigent. Human is human intelligence. That's like the James Bond stuff where you send a guy in and he tries to cultivate relationships and he tries to get assets in the opposing government and tries to get them to slip him information. But that's only really one part of the picture, and it's never really been the one the CIA has been best at. They're much better at SIGINT, so that's signals intelligence. So the United States is very technologically advanced, and one of the ways that manifests is in spycraft. The U.S. intelligence agencies, of which we have like over a dozen. It's not just the CIA. But among them are some agencies that are dedicated to collecting intelligence on signals. They'll spy on enemy communications. They'll spy on another country's internal networks. They'll spy on their research and development projects, like just anything and everything they can get their hands on. Actually, research and development projects isn't a good example of SIGINT, but you get the idea. Just anything that involves electronic emissions or signals, like communications or what have you, the U.S. has the technology that can tap that. And so the CIA will collect all of that information from other agencies and will try to process it and synthesize it. So that's kind of more what they do. During the War on Terror, they did shift to more of a kinetic disposition. There was a lot of guys who just kind of deployed with the U.S. military, basically out into Afghanistan and Iraq, and cooperated closely with special forces units, so that they could very quickly, go after targets of opportunity and whatnot. But that was kind of an aberration. That's not really representative of the kind of thing they have historically done for the most part. Mostly, again, it's just little things. The sexy stuff like paying people to protest and, overthrowing governments, that's kind of more the exception than the rule.
I don't know. It sounds pretty sexy to me. But yeah, maybe not quite like spy movies where all the agents are really good looking and hyper charismatic.
Yeah, probably considerably less sex than James Bond has in his movies. I'm sure CIA agents wished otherwise, but alas, not the case. Let's see. What is your prediction on what will happen to the sanctions when all this thing would be over? They hit regular people a lot, so as an occasional Russian on the stream, I am wondering a lot. Again, that kind of comes down to a political question of will. Like, how much longer are Western countries and populations going to remain vested in the Ukraine issue? Yeah, the Ukraine issue. You guys have me so paranoid about saying the Ukraine. Like, even when it's proper grammar, I have to double check myself.
It's like, wait, I just said those two words in a row. Was it wrong? Oh, no. In that case, it was technically correct. Okay.
In that case, yes. Yeah, it's going to come down to willpower. But I think, given how Western populations have been acting thus far, there seems to be a lot of willingness, and if not eagerness, to continue the sanctions regime. So in that sense, I don't think it's going to be lifted anytime soon. They could be lifted very quickly if Russia agreed to give a lot of concessions, but I don't think the Russian government is going to do that. I think the Putin regime is going to be much too embarrassed if they walk away from the war without something to show for it. So I suspect they're going to just keep going. So that means that the ball is kind of in the West's court as to how to respond to that. So, one school of thought is that you just go hard and sanction them to the hilt and just lay it on thick so as to cause maximum disruption. Not so much to get them to come to the negotiating table, but more just to deter future possible aggression by other countries, if not also Russia. You just want to make it clear that this kind of action is unacceptable and that you're going to punish them severely. So that's the school of thought that says negotiation with Russia is probably not going to go anywhere. So a different school says that we should slowly, well, maybe not slowly, but we should escalate sanctions over time to ramp up the pressure and create the expectation in Russia, not only among policymakers, but also amongst economic actors and other civilians, that the sanctions are just going to keep getting worse until the Russian government comes to the table and offers some concessions. So that's more of a give and take school that says that, we don't have to hit them with just maximum punishment now. We can make it clear that maximum punishment is the eventual destination if they don't come to the table.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one school of thought. And then there's another school that says it's just important to maintain, it's important for the Russian to make sure the Russians know that the sanctions are conditional, that we're not going to just implement sanctions and then never remove them. There is going to be some compromise in which the Russians could take actions that would result in sanctions relief. So that school of thought just says that, whatever we do, don't go too hard. Just make it clear that they have some kind of off-ramp, so to speak, so that they don't think that all is lost and that they're just totally fucked. So they might as well double down on the war in Ukraine and try to get as much as they can.
Mm-hmm.
So roughly, that's what you're looking at. It's just as far as sanctions, it's going to depend on willpower. I think the West has it to keep it going, but it's also going to depend on the kind of strategy that Western governments want to do. To kind of reiterate a point I made earlier, Western governments are kind of still figuring out what to do with the whole Ukraine war thing. Obviously, they want to deter Russia, so they want to support Ukraine. But again, like I said earlier, do you support them to the point where they can take back territory and actually outright win the war, or do you go with more modest goals? So if it's going to be more modest goals, then that changes the calculus a little bit. And in that case, sanctions relief is relatively more likely. I guess you could say sanctions relief is more likely if they go like full back Ukraine and get them to win the war, because if they outright win the war, then you can release, then you don't have the incentive to maintain the sanctions at that point. The adjutant in the relations is resolved in that case. Although even in that case, there would still be some sanctions. I don't think people in Europe are going to back off of sanctions just because the conflict resolves peacefully. There's still going to be some sanctions. I think, from what I've been reading, and I think I agree with this, is that the war in Ukraine represents a permanent break from the status quo as far as relations between Russia and Europe. Well, if not permanent, then at least long term. Like there's a sense now that the previous status quo is just unsustainable and that changes have to be made. So there's probably going to be some sanctions on Russia that are going to be permanent. It's just not clear how many sanctions are going to be permanent and to what extent that they're going to be permanent. So again, just a lot of variables. What does the West want to do? What are their objectives? How much does Russia want to compromise? Those are the questions that I would be looking at if I was worried about it. But for now, there's not really enough information, I would argue, to really come to a conclusion on that. The West needs to pick a strategy, which is going to require politicians in the West to actually make a decision, which is going to be very uncomfortable for them, I'm sure. Very much the political status quo in the West has been not making decisions. So we'll see if they're actually able to do it now after having been out of practice for so long. Fingers crossed. Let's see. Why does Russia have high amounts of abandoned equipment? Part of it is because they run out of gas and they just don't have anything that can tow it back, or at least tow it back quickly. Part of it, actually, I've read has to do with artillery, which I thought was weird. When I think of artillery, I think of it as being very useful against people, like infantrymen. But I don't really think of it as being that useful for tanks and armored vehicles, because I would think that unless you get like a, dead-on hit, like if you actually hit the vehicle with your artillery shell, that an armored vehicle would be relatively resilient against the explosion caused by an artillery shell going off nearby. But I was reading recently on one of the, multitudinous Ukrainian Twitter threads that I've been picking through on Twitter. There was a guy who made the case that actually near misses, artillery shells going off near armored vehicles can actually do sufficient damage to them to render them inoperable. If nothing else, it stresses, supply chains. It stresses your opponent's logistics, since they have to come up with spare parts and repair the damage done. But actually, even beyond that, some of the damage actually is so great enough that the vehicle just can't be fixed on the spot anyway. And it can be easier just to leave the vehicle in that case. And obviously, if you've been watching combat footage from Ukraine, then you've seen probably your fair share of videos of Ukrainian artillery hitting Russian targets. They're pretty accurate. They've invested a lot in, drones, spotting equipment, and maybe even guided shells. I'm not sure I've heard of that yet, but some of the accuracy would suggest they've been able to do that. But yeah, that's one of the reasons they've been abandoning vehicles. Some of them get damaged by Ukrainian shelling, and that's not really possible to salvage it in the field. And then, of course, there's desertion. It's a little hard to find concrete proof of it happening, but supposedly there have been Russians who have just walked away from their units. And, part of the result of that would be equipment, just left to be captured by whomever gets to it first. So those are 3 reasons for abandoned equipment. That's probably not a comprehensive list, but yeah, those I think are some of the most important anyway. Let's see. How do you feel about Peter Zahan and his writings, if you've read them? I've been out of the geopolitics game for a few years, so I'm a bit rusty. People ask me about this a lot. And the answer is no, I haven't read his stuff. But he seems very popular in the geopolitics crowd. I talk a lot about geography and politics and the economy, but I'm not actually that into geopolitics per se. That's kind of its own field, and it's not one that's actually considered very academic. When I was in grad school, I was curious about, geopolitics, and I was wondering if that was like a field that you could specialize in and, teach. And what I was told is that it's actually not. It's kind of more of a pseudoscience than an actual science. So
because
it's not something
a space
that...
that's
Sorry,
like it's a space that's so large that you can't really measure it with that much accuracy.
That's part of the issue, but also, if you want to study something like institutions or public policy or international relations, all of those are things that you can study on their own and that have their own fields. So, yeah, in a sense, geopolitics is just so broad. But also, if you want to study something like that, it's not really something you can study in isolate. It's something you have to study with something else, and that something else is probably going to be what determines your expertise, what becomes your expertise. There's not really such a thing as a geopolitical expert per se. There's people who are experts or who have strong backgrounds in things like international relations, negotiations, or military conflicts, terrorism, etc. And you use that knowledge in order to try to understand broader geopolitical trends and whatnot. But then there's some people who are just sort of hacks. Not Zahan. I'm not saying Zahan is a hack, but if you want to make shit up and start a YouTube channel or whatever, you can do that. If I were smarter, that's what I would have done. I could have made more money bullshitting my way through geopolitics by now, but I had it in my head to try to do something with my grad school education to try to bring that to interested parties. And so I've had to be more responsible, you could say, with my commentary.
I can think of some people who don't really try to be responsible with their commentary at all.
Yeah, there's no shortage on cable television. For
Joe
sure.
Rogan.
Oh, Joe Rogan?
Joe Rogan.
Who?
Joe Rogan.
Oh, it was Joe Rogan. Okay.
Yeah. There was a Mike Tyson guest episode. I didn't listen to it, but apparently it was them smoking weed and then talking about conspiracy theories of the government trying to eliminate homeless people or whatever.
Sounds like a Joe Rogan episode.
Yes. The issue is, unless you specifically state that you don't have full confidence in this, if you say words on the internet or on TV, there will be some share of the viewers who assume that you have handed them a fact. This is simply a fact.
Yeah.
And then some people saying that it's a comedy show. Right. Some people see it that way, that it's entertainment, that it's two people talking. There's a reason why we have a disclaimer in this show, is we want to make sure that people know that neither of us are actually fully certified, like we're the specialists in this domain, and what we say on this show is like advancing the frontiers of science and so on. We're two dudes talking. So take with this what you will. Fact check stuff. By all means, leave an angry YouTube comment that says you guys got this wrong for this segment of your show and it's actually like this, because we like to receive that kind of commentary and we'll try to fix it on the next one.
Yeah, we enjoy critiques.
The way that I think about being called out as wrong is pretty inspired by Kukio. He definitely had the same spirit, which is if you say something and then someone says, no, actually, you're totally wrong, it's this instead, some people will feel like, I need to battle to prove that I'm the smartest person in the room. But
Yeah.
a wise person will say, oh my gosh, you just saved me from being wrong about that for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And that's a big win. That's a big pickup.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things, you worry about. It's not it's not what's the old Mark Twain quote? It's not what you know that gets you. It's what you hell.
It's what you don't know that you don't know.
Yeah, that's the gist of it basically. Somebody with a better memory than me might be able to conjure it in chat.
My favorite example of having that eye opening experience of trusting an expert who was actually wrong at the time was from UTD. A friend of mine, Soupy Lol, I don't know if he's in the chat right now, but he hangs out a lot. He was in a genetics class at the same time that I was in a psychology class. And in both of these classes, we were learning about the heritability of IQ. And now I know some people, they can debate about IQ, whether it's a useful stat all day long, but nevertheless, it is a stat that you can measure with testing. And my psychology professor told the class that it's not heritable at all, meaning that it's basically just a random deal of intellect. Maybe it's based on some other factors, but it's not based on who your parents are. And I was like, oh, cool. Nice. I'll write this down. So I have my pencil and paper and I write all this down. And then, like we do, where people just gather at someone's apartment and just talk about random shit, I shared that piece of information because I thought it was kind of interesting. And he was like, what? Dude, that's wrong. And I was like, no, my professor said that. Professors, how could they be wrong? They're the expert. They're teaching us stuff and they get paid for that. And he's like, no, dude, look it up. It's this. There's some like factor for the heritability of it that's been more or less figured out. And that was like a massive eye-opening for me because I more or less assumed that once you get to be an expert in your field, you should know what you're talking about. But even experts can be wrong. Maybe he had some motivation for this. Maybe he just straight up didn't really look at the science very well enough, because psychology is more of a soft science where you're looking at human behavior and less so at like the behaviors of molecules in cells. That's more of what biology and the hard science does. So yeah, double check stuff. Just because someone wearing a suit and tie says something doesn't make it true. Just because they have a PhD doesn't make it true. Some people,
Fortunately so.
they'll even do the Deepak Chopra, which is talk about some random shit that's totally unrelated to your PhD. But for people who are not super educated, you can just throw that card on the table and say, but no, I have a PhD. And they'll be like, well, that must be very impressive. I guess you're probably right. Credentials do not make you universally correct.
I did look up the quote. So the quote was, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so."
He's got ain't in it. Let's go.
Well, he was always a folksy guy.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was one of the first to do that, wasn't he? To write in a folksy style.
Maybe. Any literary, American literature experts in the
Yeah, I'm
chat?
pig ignorant about literature, so if we do, please comment in chat. I'm genuinely curious. The closest I came to taking a class on literature was freshman year in college when I was an undergrad. And I had the choice of taking either English, which I didn't want to do, or I could take a class called World Literature.
Mm.
And we learned about literature from different countries, specifically famous authors and some of the themes and styles. And that was a lot more appealing to me than taking English again. I was hoping I would never have to take English ever again after high school. So the world literature option was very appealing.
Mm.
But yeah, other than that, not much. I'm not really able to do like a critique of literature like I would like to be. So I can't really say for sure if I'm remembering something I read about Mark Twain once, about him being one of the first folksy writers, or if that's just something that is emitting from my sleep-deprived brain.
Hmm. You can learn a lot about things that are not necessarily hard science. There was, in the circles I ran in, a pretty heavy bias against anything that was on the softer side of like human behavior. It's like, hard science is legit. If you want real science, you go chemistry, physics, brah. Just like, go for anything that has a really clear mathematical structure that can't be violated. And if it is violated, the whole thing is wrong and everyone can agree that it's wrong. Whereas with stuff like human behavior or literature and stuff, a lot of it is about your interpretation of the thing, which is, it's kind of opinion based, but there's going to be a lot of overlap in that. And then just the value of people's takes on things. You can really develop a high level of expertise for a field such as literature, where you look at the lineage of what people have written over time and how that's shaped people's ideas, which is certainly a very valuable endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
I tended to favor the harder science when it came to brain science, like just being able to measure stuff and look at stuff in neuroscience appealed to me more than psychology. But in the past, psychology was pretty much all that we had. We couldn't really look at the brain because we didn't have fMRIs and EEGs and the same surgical techniques that we do now. So it's definitely a budding and new science. But all of the different directions you could go through school, this is a fun, humbling lesson. You take the first course, like I took cognitive science, the first one, and then it seems really refreshing and cool, and you're learning stuff at such a rapid pace, but it's still a very generalized class that talks about the full breadth of it, which means you can't really get very deep on any one thing. And then by your second year, you get to take more advanced ones that focus on some specialization within that, like cellular neuroscience, integrative neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, and then you can further spec into each one on year 3, year 4, year 5. By the time you end up with the PhD, if you went that track, you would be focusing really hard on like one tiny area within the brain and one domain of how to study what's going on there. And once you got that PhD, it wouldn't be as though you're suddenly some grand expert on the brain and you can talk about everything. You would know more than most people in your little corner of where you've specialized in. And that can, just pursuing any kind of academic endeavor, it can really highlight how little we know about pretty much everything, because it's really hard to even learn most of the stuff about any one thing.
Well said.
Yeah, so Mr. Agent Smith here, maybe he doesn't have the PhD that he might have wanted, but you've climbed that mountain a lot more than I have, by a huge margin.
That's not too late.
It's not too late. It's true.
You can still get there.
Well, I'm taking it one Agent Smith at a time.
Well, I mean, you could go and do like I mean, obviously it's up to you, but I mean, I think given how disciplined you are, you could definitely get a PhD if you wanted.
Oh, for sure. I had thought about maybe doing that once I slow down a little bit, because I still like doing the fast video game stuff. And whenever I'm like 50, I can still read shit and write shit down. But I might not necessarily need to speed of hand beat someone in a reaction speed contest of momentum and violence in video games.
Yeah, discipline is really important. Having a good mindset, all that kind of stuff like you do here. Yeah, that actually translates very well to that kind of environment.
You need to have a lot of hunger for whatever the goal is too. I think that's a big part of it, because there are a lot of people who they possess the attributes to execute something, but if you don't have the desire to chase it, then you won't.
Yeah. Yeah, it takes a lot of drive, but it also takes the ability to manage your own time.
Mm-hmm.
Since in an academic setting, you really have to be able to be your own boss. And if you kind of don't grow up in an environment around people that has people like that, it can be a little jarring.
Hmm.
But you've already been doing that for years now. So yeah, I think you would fit right in.
The awesome thing, and this is different from getting a PhD about streaming, is you are held accountable by your audience who's there right now. So
Yeah.
if you like slack off and you're just like looking to the side and not saying anything for a period of time, people just leave and they go to another channel and then your metrics go down. So that's a point of pressure. Thank you, chat, for keeping me accountable and making sure that I'm constantly doing something whenever I'm live. And also being patient for the bathroom breaks, which are rather important. I take a lot more breaks than some people. They'll feel like they're pinned to their chair, that if as soon as they leave to go AFK, they're going to lose some viewers, which is true. But if you don't leave your chair ever, you get back problems and health problems and just feel crappy. So get out of your
Wow.
chair sometimes.
That's quite the power move on your part.
Hell yeah, I'll walk away from stream whenever I need to use the restroom or get some water. Or
Well, I
even,
meant more keeping them in suspense of when you're going to come back.
oh yeah. Well, I
That,
think once your chat figures out what the rhythm of your content is, they're more chill about it. And I have more of like a health emphasis than some other streamers, so I would rather get like 3 less subscribers but be happier with my like health and body as a person, so I have more energy for the viewers who do want to stick around. And it's also a good opportunity for other people to get up and stretch and things as well.
it's pretty legit. It takes charisma to be able to do that.
I think people like that though. It's one of those I do what I want energies that people tend to
Hmm.
like, because a lot of people get stuck in the you're always being driven in the direction that your boss wants you to go, that your family wants you to go, that your partner might want you to go, and being able to stand your ground and say no, I'm doing this way because it's how I do things. People like that. It also makes it clear for them who you are as a person and what makes you unique. Yeah, doing push-ups instead of StarCraft. I have a fun rule that if I ever get a new viewer who tunes in and it's been a while since I've queued for a StarCraft game, I just take a break just to spite them. Aren't you going to queue for another game? All right, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be right back. Ooh, got him.
I'm going to break my rule right here because while you were talking, I opened up the Twitch window.
Hmm.
So FreeBSD Rocks posted doing a PhD is long. It can be, but it doesn't have to be.
How do you get a
I shit
short
you not.
PhD?
I shit you not. I knew a guy when I was still in the economics program who got his PhD in 2 years. He did all of the coursework, he did the qualifier, and he defended his dissertation and got his PhD in 2 years.
How?
He just did it all in 2 years. Like there's no secret. He just did everything in 2 years. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. He knew exactly what field he wanted to specialize in. He knew exactly which professors to talk to and work
Hmm.
with in order to get research published and get work done. And he just managed his time very well.
Mm-hmm.
Like he worked on his dissertation while he was still doing coursework. Because again, he already knew what he wanted to do, so he just started working on it right away. So 2 years and then done. He was off into the job market, making the money.
Do you think he gave up sleep, a social life, or leisure time, or all of the above?
Well, he already had kids and a family, so yeah, all of the he'd already given up all that stuff. One of the things I think people don't realize about grad students is that a lot of them are actually older.
Hmm.
There are some grad students who are working on PhDs and stuff who are like younger, like in their early 20s, like I was. But generally, more of them are sort of middle-aged guys who already have families and are looking to take the next step in their professional career path
Mm-hmm.
by trying to get an upper higher level degree. So yeah, I was definitely easily like one of the youngest people there, although not the youngest.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the youngest guy there was like a 19-year-old kid who just knew all of the math. He was like a total math whiz. It was like his hobby. He did it for fun as a kid. And so by the time he got into the PhD program, he was like this math whiz who tutored other people. Like he was tutoring people like twice his age about some of the advanced econometrics concepts that we were trying to learn. He was a really amazing dude.
I had a friend like that in the TAMS program before I went to UTD, and he just liked doing math problems. So he was like the guru that people would just go to his dorm room and ask for help before the test. And he would be able to explain it really well because he would finish the homework and he would be like, let's do the bonus problems. Let's look at the next chapter. Oh, that's pretty easy. Okay, I already did most of those. And then he would like get some other crusty book from the library that was also about the same thing that had some different problems that he could do, and he would just do those. So, yeah. He aced his math classes largely because, kind of like Agent Smith, he just liked being in that area, and it wasn't like work for him where, now you have to do this math problem. It was like, you have to do 10 math problems, and he's like, give me 50.
Yeah, when it's fun, it's much easier. You kind of do it on your own initiative. It becomes like what do you call it? You do it without even thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like with how you can like play high level StarCraft while still having a conversation. Like you've just done it so many times and enjoy it so much that, it just kind of comes naturally. So you can kind of walk and chew bubble gum at the same time.
Yeah. Not necessarily the best StarCraft, but some hopefully decent StarCraft. That last game that I was in, I was a little bit tilted. I'm trying to listen to you in the conversation, and it's a very clearly a Smurf account. You can tell based on the way that they move their pieces, like that first Reaper that shows up, that's going to be a signal of how good this player is for the rest of the game based on how close of attention they pay to it and how they try to mess up each of your different objectives that you have. So if you're against a worse player, they kind of just show up with the Reaper and he just kind of trips over himself and dies. And if you're against a Terran who's really good, that Reaper shoots a gun and throws a grenade at everything that you're trying to do. And it's a pretty major difference in feeling. And this person queued into me as like a mid-low Masters player, and their Reaper control is easily a GM from the start. So I have to fight a Grandmaster with a Masters 2 worth of MMR while juggling the conversation about the income disparity in the United States. He's like putting liberators in my base. And then they're like, what about the middle class? What about the billionaires? And it's like, man, this Terran's about to be a billionaire if I don't stop him.
And very impressive skills, sir.
Thanks. Bless mom and dad for the speed. And then also bless Kukio for the opportunity to no life this game. There was a thing that I did that makes it's crazy to me that people can get to the Twitch partner level and things like that with a job on the side. But I pretty much YOLO'd it with as much stream uptime as possible and then as much sleep as I needed. And I had no schedule, like no weekly obligations if I needed to work this job at this time or show up for this place at that time. So I could just do 12-hour stream, 9 hours sleep, and just spam that. And we ended up getting there, and now I have a schedule. Like, we've been doing Agent Smith almost at the same hour of the day for quite a few weeks.
Yeah. We've been pretty consistent on that.
Yep. Got the WoW raids 1 p.m. on the weekends. And then I raid in a different guild on Monday, Wednesday. We have D&D on Thursdays or philosophy. Our last philosophy episode was on the philosophy of change. Specifically, changing as a person. So changing your habits and what you do and just like change within the world and when you want to decide whether to use a routine or to change something. People live more ordered or more chaotic lives depending on who they are and what they've trained themselves to do and that kind of a thing. Magnifico looks forward to hearing from Agent Smith each Sunday. Yeah, the nice thing about having a schedule is people can show up to the stream and get the content they expect every time. It's awesome to me, too, that the viewership goes up a lot from Agent Smith. I remember in the first couple years that we were doing this, most people would tune in, be confused, and then leave. And it would be like I would have a viewership at a certain point, and then we would start and it would go down. And lately it's been people are like just showing up ready to go, trying to get in the door whenever Agent Smith is on.
Their support is appreciated.
Hell yeah.
Are we doing okay on time?
Well, we're at a reasonable winding down point. If you wanted to have any closing thoughts and stuff, we've been on for 2 hours 45, and you've been up since 6.
Yeah, it's been a while. Well, I was going to ask Dagnip if he's listening, if he received my email. I just want to make sure it didn't end up in his spam folder.
Dagnip, please check your email.
Yeah.
He was in the chat earlier. I don't know if he
I see that we have an Argentina flag down in the flag section. I assume it would be him. I don't know how many other Argentines we have listening.
Agent Smith is an excellent way to spend a Sunday evening to chill before work on Monday. And Loopy says, I never miss an Agent Smith segment. Dagnip says he got it. He's here. Nice.
Oh, cool. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to check. No hurry on responding. I don't want to pressure you at all. And then I was going to ask you about the video thing, because there's like, they're not automatically loading anymore. Is that what it was?
Yeah, so remind me if I ever forget to do that. They changed the policy. Basically, they have like a series of layers between getting sued by the big music record labels and what the Twitch streamers are doing and have been doing. People have been playing music on Twitch since its inception and pretty much whatever kind of music they want. And there have been a series of slaps at Twitch that have caused them to try to take precautions. So they have a 3-strike system if you get a takedown request. And then they added another layer, which is if your broadcast for the day has any copyrighted music at any point in it, the entire video starts out as unpublished. You can still publish it and then post it, and then you can read the chat and things like that after. But yeah, it's just a way to make things even more difficult for, say, a record label company to go to a channel and say, hey, look, there's this music here. They would have to be subscribed, and then the streamer would also have to publish it. So further and further steps to keep them safe on that front. One thing that is on my to-do list is you can split your audio channels, where you have one audio channel that's just the microphone, and then another audio channel that might be the game sounds, and then you split the, say, Chrome or whatever browser source you have that's feeding in music, and you just say that is not saved to the VOD, but everything else is saved. So once that change goes through, for any of the Neuro VODs, it would just be me and the StarCraft content. The music would more or less be a mystery to you for what it was.
Huh.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of hassle just for some music rights.
It is a lot of hassle. I can understand why they're wanting to get their piece of the pie and that kind of stuff, but the content is very transformative. So most streamers, they're not like playing music and they're like, pure evil, yes. It's more like this doesn't seem like it's morally wrong to do, but basically the companies that have the most money and the greatest stake in the record label industry are the most aggressive. And they're getting at people. But our account is in fine standing. I have been issued no strikes. It does help that I listen to obscure metal. The record labels and stuff like that typically aren't quite as aggressive with the lawyers. It's pop music. So if you hear music on the radio, top 40 stuff, the most billion viewed YouTube songs and stuff like that, right to jail right away.
Gotcha. I was just going to ask about it. Just I didn't want to, I didn't want it to be a thing, if it was a hassle to do it.
Nope, it takes 2 clicks for me to publish it. It's
Oh,
pretty,
really?
yeah, pretty easy. I just click the video and then I click publish. Yes. So 3 clicks, I guess.
Okay. Gotcha.
I'll try to remember to do that after today's stream.
Yeah, I noticed sometimes I was, what I think last week, or maybe, I don't remember when it was, but sometimes I'll go on stream to your archive just to see the Saturday episode, because sometimes you'll mention whether or not you're going to skip Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed one week that you hadn't really posted anything, and I thought, oh, you must be on vacation or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then you came back, and it turned out that it was just the videos weren't uploading.
Yeah. I should just keep publishing them now, because there are some people, say from EU and stuff, who will not be able to watch the stream when it's live, but they still like the content, so they'll just watch it as a video later.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, how is Eche Fatum supposed to watch?
Yeah. Well, he typically will tune in at the end or the start of the stream with the EU time. Random movie stuff. Did you see Batman and Spider-Man yet?
Oh, God, I haven't seen any movies in months.
What about shows? No. Did you ever play Halo?
I did not.
Oh. For people who played the games, the show is fun.
Is it?
Yeah.
Wait, there's a show?
There's a show.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
On a platform called Paramount Plus, which I didn't believe that it existed, but it exists.
Isn't that where they show Star Trek?
It might be.
Or is that CBS?
I think we can all agree that there are too many goddamn TV platforms right now.
Yeah, people on Reddit were joking about that, and they were saying that it was basically just turning into a rehash of cable.
Yeah.
Where if you want like a full package of shows and stuff, you just kind of have to buy them all.
Yeah.
Which is what people were trying to get away from. But on the upshot, you can just be stingy. Just pay for one at a time. You know, pay for 1 month, then end it, and then pay for another one, so you can just watch what you want as you want it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most of the time, I mean, most folks listening are older, right? So you know that back in the day when everybody had cable, most people didn't watch most of the channels that they got.
Mm-hmm.
You just kind of had them and they were there. So, you know, if you have something like Netflix or another streaming service, I mean, unless you're like a heavy user, you're probably not using it all that often.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it kind of makes sense to just pay for it when you want it rather than just having it in perpetuity. I'm sure Netflix would prefer you to have it in perpetuity. They're having some issues with subscribers right now. I don't know if you saw that news at all, did you?
Yeah, password sharing, they're doing a crackdown, so a bunch of people are bailing.
Yeah. Well, more than that, they're having a problem with subscribers dropping the service.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they need to keep their subscriber base growing in order to ensure market confidence, but it's been shrinking lately. They say it's because of COVID-19. You know, they say that it went up, spiked, you know, obscenely high, basically, because everybody was quarantined. You know, everybody was locked down in 2020. But since then, the lockdown policies have kind of eased. And so that unnaturally high sub increase has kind of moderated. So that's what they're blaming for the decrease in subscribers.
38% of its stock value? Oof.
Yeah, they felt it. But we'll see. It could be a structural decrease too. It could be that consumer behavior is changing. It could be that the business model is changing. You know, I remember many, many years ago when Netflix was a DVD by mail service. That was actually how I got. Yeah. That was how they did that was all of their business. They were basically the Blockbuster killer. You don't have to go to a store to rent stuff. You can just rent it by mail.
Blockbuster was fun, though. I remember liking to go there because you can go and you can like look at different stuff and read the back of what the description is and maybe go to a different part of it or just like look at stuff for fun that you would never sit down and watch that. But it's like, man, someone would watch this.
Yeah, it was cool to browse the aisles. I definitely remember that. That's something you can't really do these days.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could say you can browse online because they've got all the recommendations and stuff on
It's
Netflix, but
just
it's not really the
pictures.
same
Yeah.
because that's all kind of curated. The aisle's also kind of curated, but not really, not in the same way. You never knew what you were going to find there. If you want to find something weird and obscure on Netflix, you kind of got to hunt for it a little bit.
Mm.
But back when it was a DVD service, they had a much broader selection. The streaming stuff that they do now their streaming library is much more limited.
Mm.
And that just has to do with all the different companies, all the rights holders for all the different movies being a lot more stingy about who they give licenses to. Didn't used to have, a Paramount streaming service or a CBS service or a Fox service that had all their own stuff. Nobody really had their own proprietary streaming service. So they didn't really care about licensing to Netflix to do it, or Hulu, as the case may be. That's still a thing, isn't it? Is Hulu still around?
Maybe.
Haven't thought about it in a long time. That was supposed to be like the new TV thing, right? They were just going to have free content online and they'd make their money from ads.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I watched that probably more than I should have when I was in grad school procrastinating. I don't think they still do that, though. I think it's pretty much all subscriber based now in Hulu, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. Haven't checked in a while. Well, before we jet here, I just wanted to sneak in some corrections. We already did Oceania, so that's one. Um, Clever Name 2 pointed out that, well, we were talking about call centers last week, and I was saying that pretty much all of the call centers are shifting to a remote work model. But Clever Name 2 pointed out that Wells Fargo says that they're trying to push to get their call centers back in office. So apparently I was wrong. Apparently there's at least one company that wants the call centers back in a building. Let's see, regarding Pakistan, Rainforest 64 said that the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, imposing IMF austerity regulations lost him some popular support as well. So we were talking a little bit about the vote of no confidence and why the government had become somewhat unpopular. And besides the fallout in relations between Khan and the military, apparently there was also this IMF issue. So thank you to Clever Name 2 and Ryan464 here for offering some of these corrections and addendums. Also, I said that people in Pakistan were mostly on board, quote unquote, with military control of the political system, implicit control anyway. Apparently, Ryan464 disagreed with that and said that actually, no, most people are not on board with it. They just can't fight military power without severe consequence. So it's more something they've just sort of made peace with, I guess, is what I would infer from that. So thank you for that correction as well. But yeah, that's all I had for this week.
Cool. Well, thank you,
Oh, we
viewers.
didn't get any Ukraine in, but yeah, that's also happening.
Yeah, we got a bit in with the question of how long will it last.
Yeah.
Some upsides with Bitter Sugar and his family able to move back to Kyiv and that sort of thing. But yeah, the conflict isn't over for sure. But we'll have to check in on that for the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Remember, if we fucked up anything in this episode, please God, give us a YouTube comment so we can correct the error of our ways. Agent Smith, thank you for your time. Take care of yourself. And I will now bless you with a challenge for a 20-minute walk this week.
Oh, fuck.
Oh, he got him. Sneak it in at the end. Take care of yourself, sir.
That. Will do. Thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure and a privilege. And I'll see you next time.
Yep. Take care. And that's another Agent Smith. People are wondering who these nice dogs are. This is Rambo. He's upper left, Ripley, his younger sister. And they're Australian Shepherd dogs. We took a nice video of them in the heckin' snow in South Dakota. Oh, fuck. We got him. We got him.